6 p.m. So I will call this budget meeting of Council of the Municipality of Jasper to order. We don't actually have an item on the agenda to approve the agenda, so I will leave it be, having called us to order. Just as a bit of information, we are scheduled for 3 hours tonight and another 3 hours tomorrow evening. It would be my intent that if we move swiftly this evening and manage to get to the last couple of items, capital budget review in particular, we can leave that until tomorrow night. So I would propose that we won't get beyond agenda item 2.7 in any event, but we will wait to see whether we even get that far. It will be a bit of work, but I think Mr. Given and his team have presented a fairly readable document, and everybody's had about a week roughly to dive into it. So there should be lots of questions and equally lots of answers. For those who attended AUMA last week, particularly the elected official education program, the first couple of days, you heard repeatedly the phrase drinking from a fire hose. I expect this will be just more of the same. There's an awful lot of information to be presented, but as I say, Mr. Given and his team have done a wonderful job, I think, focusing our attention where it needs to be. So I will invite Mr. Given to give that introduction, and within that introduction, I know that there is proposed decision-making timelines. So just for those members of the public who are watching tonight, this is an information meeting. There will not be decisions made tonight. We will receive information regarding the budget tonight and again tomorrow night. And then based on the proposed decision-making timelines that you will hear in a few minutes, we will be making decisions over the next 4 to 6 weeks to come up with both an operating budget and a capital budget for 2022. So, Mr. Given, I turn it to you to begin the presentation with the introduction and the overview.
Well, thanks very much, Mayor Ireland, Council. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of administration to present the 2022 operating and 2022 to 2026 capital budgets. We have a bit of a different style of presentation for you. Council, you received a fair bit of documentation last week. And so we will guide you through some of that documentation while also providing some contextual information. My belief is that data like lines and numbers is not really particularly useful unless you have the context to be able to build that into information that'll enable decision making. And so my hope is that this evening we'll be able to provide you both the data and the context that allows you to be informed, that allows the community to understand the municipal budget, and for you to be in a position in a couple of weeks' time to start to make some decisions with respect to the budget. So I think the appropriate place to start is really with my screen sharing, I suppose, first off. And so we'll put that up, and I'll just confirm that all council members can see that. I can see a few heads nodding, so I'll assume that that applies to everybody. And so council will head right into the 2022 budget presentation. The municipality of Jasper as an organization is now 20 years old, as we celebrated crossing that milestone of local government self-determination that was achieved in 2001, and now we're 20 years on. And over the course of that 20 years, the municipality has, of course, been delivering municipal services day in and day out. And this doesn't change, even reflective of the council election terms. And I think it's important to note that municipal budgets are an inherently tricky thing because they impact this ongoing service delivery or the municipal services that people rely on for many, many things in their life. And it also impacts the services that people don't even necessarily realize the municipality is delivering. And it's all in the context of council getting elected, and pretty shortly after that election being asked to consider a budget, because municipal budget cycles work on an annual basis, calendar year basis. So in spite of the fact that all of you were just recently elected, you are here in a 4-year term, and the municipal service delivery can be really considered in the context of your 4-year term, broken into 4 chunks. And so as you start off your term, you're looking to influence municipal service delivery towards, I would imagine, ultimately a vision and some priorities that each of you had when you chose to run for council. And the question really is, how do your individual priorities that you had influence municipal spending, municipal programs, and ultimately the community of Jasper? Really, that begins with council's strategic plan. There is a connection between council's vision and goals as put down in a strategic plan, which administration then uses to imagine municipal services, which we then present back to you in terms of a budget. And so we are near the start of that process with one important caveat that I'll mention as we go through, but that process of strategic plan developed by council, setting out the strategic direction that you would like to take, influences the business plan that is developed by administration. So early in the new year, when the newly elected council develops its strategic plan, the thing that happens after that is administration will take your strategic goals, your strategic aims, and translate those into municipal services. And we'll discuss that process a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. But that business plan influences what we're going to need for resources to act on the directions that council sets. And those resources end up showing up in a budget. And so that would be in the first year of your term. And then we would check in on your strategy and how administration is doing and moving towards your strategic objectives. At the start of the second year, administration would revise our business plans as necessary and present a revised budget to you, council, in the fall of that second year, and so on throughout the course of your 4-year term. Now, the real challenge in local government is, of course, through that process, you have not yet had a chance to do your strategic plan. And so administration's business planning really is based on the views and the strategic plan of the past council. But let's have a little bit of a reminder that throughout that entire cycle, both council and administration are evaluating the programs and the services of the municipality and looking for opportunities to improve, revise, or enhance service as we go along. So the service delivery continues, the evaluation of the services continue, and council and administration go through the cycle of strategic planning, business planning, and ultimately budget. So let's look at the elements of a strategic plan. And council, I will just pause to say that as I'm going through, if there's anything that anybody had any questions about at any part of the presentation, please, by all means, and I may not be able to see all of you at the same time. So if there was something that you want to say, in your worship, I'll just check to make sure that this is okay with you. If somebody turned on their microphone just to gain our attention so they can be recognized, because I'm happy to take questions during the presentation if that works for you, Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Given. It does. I'm fettered by the same constraints as you. I can't see everybody at the same time. So if anybody has a question, just chime in and we'll deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Your Worship. So with respect to council's strategic plan, it really needs to begin with a vision. And a vision is where council states its desired future state for the community of Jasper. And this future state is intended to be ambitious, reflect ideal outcomes, and really be stated through the eyes of somebody who is standing in Jasper 20 to 50 years from now and describing what they're seeing. And it really sets the stage for a useful tension between where we are today and where we want to be in the future. That future vision describing everything as though we've been successful in all of our goals and objectives. Visions are usually framed in using statements like Jasper is, Jasper has, Jasper enjoys, really speaking to that perspective of somebody standing there in 2031, 2031, 2041, 2051, and describing what it is that they're seeing in a successful community. So that would be the council's vision. The vision, underpinning the vision, are also council priorities. Priorities capture the fundamental purposes for which the municipality exists, and they need to be both broad enough to have staying power from year to year over the course of your 4-year term, but also be specific enough to be meaningful and measurable so that the municipality can act on them. And they should be expressed in terms of results or outcomes that are valuable to the public. So these would be statements like Jasper delivers, provides, maintains, enhances, reduces. And so this is work that we will engage with council on early in the start of the new year. Together, those two items, council's vision and the priorities that support that vision, provide the foundational direction for the next step in that cycle that I showed you earlier on, which is the administrative business plan. An administrative business plan is an attempt to identify the resources that are available to the municipality. These include human resources and the knowledge and skills of our workforce and the individuals within our municipal workforce. It reflects the financial resources of our municipality from all sources, including taxes, user fees, charges, grants, debt capacity, and other revenues. And it also reflects the physical assets that we have in the municipality that are available to us to assist in delivering programs and services. And those physical assets can include items such as facilities, fleet, roads, underground utility infrastructure, outdoor parks and green spaces, and all the things that we think of as the physical infrastructure of the municipality. Together, these three elements really do describe the organization's capacity to take action in delivering municipal programs and services to support the direction that council sets. So those actions and programs and services, there's really a wide array of them that we're already delivering today. As I mentioned, of course, the municipality is in continuous and ongoing operations. But these actions are essentially the programs and services that are accessed by residents, businesses, and visitors day in and day out in the community. So the question really becomes, how do we ensure the municipality is using our resources, as I described, to deliver programs and services or actions that are clearly aligned with council's stated priorities and help us move towards council's vision? And that brings me to priority-based budgeting. We've had some discussion towards the end of last term and as we've entered into this new budget cycle about priority-based budgeting. And Budget 2022 begins to set the stage for our transition to priority-based budgeting. I know that it sounds like a really fancy term, and there is actually a priority-based budgeting that is a registered trademark, and we're using the term very broadly here because we don't see the need to use the consultant services that come along with that trademark term. But priority-based budgeting simply is that process of achieving a perfect alignment of municipal actions with council's priorities. In a perfect world, it would look something like this. All of our actions would be perfectly aligned with the priorities of council, which would all lead towards the vision that council had set. But in a practical reality, recognizing that the municipality is already delivering services and has been since 2001, and many of our services are really focused around the priorities that have been set by the last council, we need to figure out a way to transition to evaluate our actions, programs and services, and decide how we can get a better alignment with council's priorities. And that's what priority-based budgeting is. Budget 2022 sets the stage for this, at least in a limited form, through the service profiles that are contained in your budget package. They are the starting point of being a bit more, having discrete descriptions of the actions or programs of the municipality that are possible to evaluate and score. But the next step in priority-based budgeting is to do further refinement and breaking down the program areas into more discrete units, and then to actually start to examine them so that we can actually classify whether they're in high alignment with council's priorities, whether they're mostly aligned, somewhat aligned, or whether they have low alignment. And so to do that, administration will essentially pull out some of the actions, examine them, score them using a matrix, and assign them to which category. So through the course of priority budgeting, we will be able to arrive at a point where we can identify to council and the community exactly how much of our resources, again, human resources, financial resources, or physical assets, are being assigned to high priority items with a high level of alignment with council priorities, ones that are mostly aligned or ones that are somewhat aligned. We may even identify that there are some actions that we're currently taking that are not particularly well aligned with council's priorities. And that is the basis for conversation between administration, council, and the community about those services that are showing a low level of alignment. We can decide to, we can examine the services and question whether they're something the municipality needs to continue to offer. If we decide that it is a service that's no longer a priority for the community or no longer relevant to the community, we have an opportunity to decide what we'd like to do about that. Should we reallocate the resources that were dedicated to that action to something that is a higher priority action and enhance it? Should we discontinue the utilization of those resources and essentially lower our property tax requisition? All of this is facilitated by that process of identifying our municipal programs and services at a very discrete level, and then going through and actually scoring them all. And ultimately, the goal would be to arrive where we have a much better alignment of our municipal programs and services or actions with council's priorities. Now, the challenging thing with all of this, which sounds really great in theory, is where we are in the municipal cycle. I'll just identify that really we are actually off the side of this page. We are doing a budget prior to council having been able to do their strategic plan. And that can seem like a bit of a misalignment, but it is just a fact of municipal government, recognizing that we run on a calendar year budget cycle. It also is a feature for all municipalities across the province. And it does mean that your budget that you set at the end of your term will have an influence on the new council following the election. So this is really just a part of the process of local government. But I thought it would be helpful for council and the community to understand how your strategic plan that you do in January will set the stage for administration to do the business planning in a priority-based budgeting approach and present council a budget that demonstrates how the municipal resources are aligned with council's priorities so that we can enter 2023 with a greater level of alignment between what we're delivering and the direction that council wants to go. We'll just pause there and ask if there are any questions, comments, or observations about the priority-based budgeting approach or the strategic planning cycle.
Councillor DeVota, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say right off the bat, I'm really impressed with the intro and the description of what we're going through and how we're going through it going forward. So kudos. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor DeVota. It's nice to get that early confidence boost at the start of the presentation. Much appreciated. Your Worship, Council, if there weren't any other questions, then I'll continue from there.
I think it's safe to do so. Thank you, Mr. Given.
Okay. Again, I'll just check to make sure that everybody can see that new slide with the proposed decision-making timelines. Okay, thank you. Well, and so municipal budgets do run on a calendar year basis. They are a forecast of revenue and expense in the upcoming year, and so they are not an exact science. There are lots of unknowns, and I'm going to discuss a little bit of that in a few slides. But there is a very important factor for the community in terms of approaching budgets and making decisions as close as possible to the calendar year. And so administration is proposing the following for decision-making with respect to budget. This evening and tomorrow, we have public presentation and questions of the budget. And we would hope to be in a position, we would hope that council would be in a position to consider the capital budget at the committee meeting of November 30th, so next week. So that council might be in a position to recommend, make some decisions, adjustments, amendments if needed at that committee meeting, and ultimately to recommend the capital budget to council for the December 7th meeting for final decision there. The reason that we have capital budget coming first is because, as we'll discuss in a few slides, capital projects, we have some significant capital projects coming up for 2022. And we've also seen significant lead times of certain kinds of products becoming more and more challenging and timelines getting longer. And as a local government, we have requirements and responsibilities to ensure that any of our procurement goes through a public process. So it is a little bit different than people might experience in their own businesses or in their own private lives. If you need something, you have a look, see if you have enough money to do it, and you go and buy it. As a local government, we have an increased standard of transparency and financial accountability. So for many or most of the items in our capital budget, it means that we need to establish a request for proposals or a tender package, which there are usually a number of weeks to develop that package. That package has to be publicly advertised so that bidders from, in many cases across the country, have the opportunity to bid. Along with, of course, local bidders, but it has to be posted on something called Alberta Purchasing Connection, which allows suppliers from across the country to be able to see that. And that's a requirement of many of the free trade agreements that are signed both between provinces and between Canada and other countries. So we have a requirement to do that. That is a legislated requirement that we cannot avoid. But it does mean that something has to be first developed for posting, posted, and then after the posting deadline, any or all the submissions have to be evaluated, which, speaking from experience, can take a couple of weeks. And that's before you're in a position to offer to order something from a supplier. Moreover, for significant capital projects, many suppliers are booking their business for the 2022 capital construction season early in the new year. And so if we're in a position of passing a capital budget late in the year or in the spring, quite often, particularly for construction projects, many of the road builders and others that we might hope would bid on our work have already actually booked their work for the year, and it can be very challenging to get in. So that's why the capital budget is coming first, and we are hopeful that council will feel comfortable making decisions by December 7th to finalize the capital budget. And then we would expect to follow that fairly closely with presenting the operating budget for decision-making to council on December 14th, with the ultimate goal of having the 2022 operating budget approved by council on January 7th, if you see fit. Any questions or discussion on the budget timelines? I see Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, not about the timelines. Although if we were to work with those timelines, I think for me, I'd like to see a list of capital projects from last year and how we did. And, are we biting off too much? I feel like some years we do. So we have this big, large list of capital projects and not 100% or even sometimes 75% get done. So, I just like to see that in future meetings. But other than that, that's a good timeline. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Councillor Wilson. Yeah, certainly we'll talk about what we're going to call carry forward projects. It is reflected in the capital budget, but we will highlight that for council's attention as we do the capital budget presentation tomorrow. If there are any questions that are left unanswered at that time, by all means, we can develop some additional information before we go to committee. Any other questions before I move on to the next slide?
Just before you leave this, Mr. Given, I just want to clarify for council and for members of the public who are watching that of the timeline that you showed us, November 30th is effectively a committee of the whole date. So that will be for, I think the word you used was consideration. December 7th is a regular council meeting day. So I'm anticipating that your request is that we if we can, make a decision on the capital budget on December 7th. December 14 is again committee of the whole, so appropriately consideration of operating budget and potentially a motion to recommend a decision by council sitting as council, which will then happen on January 7th of 2022, and that would be the date for a decision on the operating budget. Is that consistent with your thought on timelines?
Yes, Your Worship. I recognize the council needs some space. I have no doubt that there'll be some discussion and debate on different budget items, and that would happen at the committee level. So council would have an opportunity to direct amendments to the capital budget and operating budget at those committee meetings. And once committee is satisfied with the budget in that meeting, then we would look for a motion from committee to recommend that council approve the budget, the capital budget as amended, and then finally the operating budget as amended.
Thank you for that. Councillor Melnick.
For the benefit of everyone, I think we have a small typo. January 4th is a Tuesday. That would be our regular council meeting. January 7th actually would be a Friday. So I think it's just a typo, but for the clarity for the public, we'd be looking at approving this on January 4th.
Thanks, Councillor Melnick, for that catch. Absolutely, the 7th is a Friday. And thank you very much for highlighting that. It absolutely is just a typo. Thank you. Okay, if there are no other questions on timelines, then I will move forward in the presentation. There we go. So as I mentioned, there are a number of factors that are really impacting both our personal lives and business operations across the community and really across the world. The municipality of Jasper is not immune to these global and some localized factors. So administration thought it was worthwhile to present a little bit of an environmental scan about the types of items that are impacting the forward-looking budget. As I mentioned, there certainly are global factors that are impacting and putting pressure on businesses worldwide. The Bank of Canada recently noted that a number of these interrelated factors are likely to keep the rate of inflation above pre-pandemic levels before beginning to see inflation ease back into 2023. We all saw that some recent price spikes, early part of the year with lumber, going to really extreme amounts and then declining. And we're still seeing that in a number of different products. This arises from a number of different reasons. First, shipping costs have been increasing. We have all heard about the challenges at international ports with products piling up on the shores because there isn't transportation to get them to the right place. Ultimately, that impact, and along with the terrible situation that we've seen in British Columbia, are likely to ensure that transportation costs will continue to run high through 2022. RBC estimates that they're currently running at about 7 to 8 times above what transportation costs were running pre-pandemic. Additionally, the slowdown during the pandemic means that both businesses and individuals have higher than normal levels of liquid assets. Basically, people have more money in their savings accounts, and businesses hadn't been spending in the same way. RBC estimates that there's approximately $280 billion in household excess savings. People are moving about more, they're spending, and as the economy reopens, this means that there's going to be an increasing amount of demand at a time where supply is still limited because of factory closures and the transportation challenges that I mentioned. And so anytime that you have high demand and low supply, it tends to lead to increased costs. The final global factor that is impacting the world and that Jasper cannot avoid is competition for labor. In August of 2021, across Canada, job vacancies stood at an all-time high, with nearly 5.2% of all jobs being unfilled or vacant. And a recent Bank of Canada survey showed that approximately 20% of all workers said that they expect to voluntarily leave their jobs in the next year. So we are entering a time of that I've heard anecdotally called the Great Resignation, where people, I think, are reevaluating their life options coming out of the pandemic. I see two people on screen who have recently changed, their careers. So that's over 20% of our council members have recently engaged in this. And I say it with a smile, but it is a fact, and it is a fact that means that when there's this much, that many unfilled jobs, and this much churn in the labor market, it means that it's highly likely that salaries will have to increase over the next while. And certainly at a bare minimum, there's going to be a high competition for labor. We've certainly seen that here in the community as people we're not seeing the same kind of migration in for seasonal work as we have in the past. And ultimately this flows down to the municipality. So those are some of the global factors that are impacting the municipality of Jasper. And let's turn next to some of the localized factors. So those localized factors that are putting pressure specifically on the Jasper 2022 municipal budget include items like increased policing costs. As the municipality has entered the realm where the province is now collecting from municipalities that didn't previously pay or contribute towards policing. Jasper's policing costs will increase by approximately $63,000 in budget 2022. And that is forecast to increase again in 23 and into 24, as the province is ultimately looking for municipalities like Jasper to contribute approximately 30% of the cost of policing in those communities. But in 2022, we have just approximately $63,000 in enhanced costs for policing without any additional police resources being dedicated to the community. Also, the municipality of Jasper has collective agreements with CUPE, our local union. The union and management were able to negotiate a 0% wage increase for 2021. But in 2022, the negotiated settlement will see a 1.25% increase. And that is a number that has to be included in our municipal budget as well. Another item is the resumption of regular land rent. Through 2020 and part of 2021, the federal government provided land rent relief to renters across the country. This also applied to the municipality of Jasper and Banff and the land rent that we pay to the federal government. Unfortunately, that land rent relief program has expired, and in 2022, Jasper will again be paying the full land rent amount that we had in the past. And so for the last couple of years, the municipal budget didn't need to carry this full amount, but going into 2022, we now again need to carry the full land rent that we paid to the federal government. Additional local contextual issues or items are a reduction in the use of the COVID recovery reserve. The 2021 budget, the municipality applied $1 million of the COVID recovery reserve to reduce the impact of the property tax increase and the increase in municipal revenues. The 2022 budget proposes to reduce the application of the funding source to just $500,000. And we can discuss that more in the operating budget when we get to the finance and administration section. But I know that it will be of interest to council and the community about how much of that COVID recovery reserve is being applied. And the 2022 base budget as presented to council and in this budget package to the community assumes the use of $500,000. But again, that is a reduction from the $1 million that we used last year. Forward-looking, administration would propose to draw down that use in 2023 to just $250,000. So essentially a slower drawdown of the COVID recovery reserve while still using it to mitigate the increase in property taxes. The final item that is impacting the 2022 budget is debt servicing. As council and the community well know, we accepted some significant capital projects last year, specifically the Connaught Utilities project, which I'm happy to see that there is asphalt covering everything now, and I'm sure the community is happy as well. But council knows that that was a significant capital undertaking, and essentially the bill starts to become due in 2022. We also have in the capital budget the proposed major renovation of the activity center. And I'll just say here that when I speak about the activity center, I'm meaning the activity center, the fitness and aquatic center, and the arena. I'm seeing them as a collective, but there is a major capital project which the municipality has significant grants for, but we also need to make a municipal contribution, and that will be funded through debt. And those debt payments will begin in 2022. There is also some regular borrowing that we do for the wastewater treatment plant capital items. But altogether, these increased debt servicing costs by just under $1 million in 2022 budget. And so those are items that are built into the base budget that are not discretionary and are not really connected with a enhanced service level, unless of course we count the utilities project and the ability to have an opportunity to achieve new housing on those Connaught lots. But they are not directly related to new staffing or new programs of the municipality, but they are something that we need to build into our 2022 budget. I'll pause to take a breath there and just ask if there are any questions at this stage. Seeing none, Your Worship, maybe I'll, if you wait long enough.
Yeah, no question. It was just, yeah, I appreciate you highlighting the big ticket items that, substantially affect the budget this year. Quite large items, and clearly we see it in the outcome, but I appreciate, you shedding light on it. Thanks,
Councillor Wilson. If there weren't any other questions, I thought it might be worthwhile. Sorry, Your Worship.
Yes, I just wanted to add, for the benefit of council and again for members of the community who might be watching, I do appreciate that you have projected that we will be back to full land rent payments for 2022, but do not take that as any suggestion that we have given up our lobby efforts. We're still working on the elimination of land rent for our community. And recently, in fact, just Friday of last week, Mr. Gibbon and I and the mayor of Banff and the CAO for Banff met with the Minister of Tourism for the federal government to discuss that very issue. So appropriate to put it in the budget and anticipate that it will be paid, but not to suggest that we have given up the fight on that.
Indeed, Your Worship, correct. And that's, at the outset, I said that budgeting is both an art and a forecast. There is an art that Ms. Malinchuk knows to building the municipal budget, and some of that includes forecasting and essentially making best estimates of what we can expect to see happen based on these global and local factors and other trends that we've seen. And Your Worship, we know that ultimately, I expect that ultimately you'll have some success with the federal government. We certainly will work towards that. But on the administrative side, we can't expect that we won't have to pay it until somebody tells us so. So I think you're 100% correct there that we'll continue the path. But for the purposes of budget 2022, we have to assume that it will be paid. I will move on a little bit because another factor that council members and the public are often very interested in, and I did just touch on, was municipal debt. Municipalities, I think, need to consider debt in a slightly different perspective than you might in your home or business. We have, as local governments, we have to take under consideration significant capital projects that are very major. And we need to consider those capital projects and the assets they deliver under long time horizons, recognizing that the municipality will outlive us all. And it needs to be here to continue to deliver services to residents. And so we can afford to take a longer time horizon than any one of us might in our own individual households, where we're saving for retirement and trying to ensure that we don't have a big debt load going into retirement, or in a business where you might have different considerations as well. So municipal debt is a little bit different. And there are actually two different types of municipal debt limits that are imposed on local governments by the Government of Alberta through the Municipal Government Act. Both of these limits are directly related to the total revenue that a municipality reports in its audited financial statements. So how much you can borrow depends on how much revenue you bring in. The first of those two types of debt limits is what we think of as the debt limit. It is calculated at 1.5 times the revenue of the municipality that is shown in the previous, in the financial statements. And in Jasper's case, and so to think of it a slightly different way, this is how big a house can you buy? If we've had that experience of going to the bank and say, well, how much house can I buy? They look at your financials as an individual and they say, well, based on your income, the maximum amount we can loan you is X. And that's what the debt limit is for the municipality. The province of Alberta looks at our revenue and says, okay, well, your revenue in a given year was X. And so you can borrow 1.5 times of X. And you can see here that in 2019, our debt limit, our total debt limit, was just over $29 million. And you'll see that it actually declined. Our debt limit declined in 2020 down to $27.8 million. That decline is a reflection of the reduction of revenue in 2020. So that reduction in revenue to respond to the impacts of COVID on local businesses and to reduce the tax levels also was directly reflected in a reduction in our municipal overall debt limit. The other type of debt that the municipality is responsible for reporting to the government and is limited by the government on is the service on debt limit. And again, just to bring it back home to something that's a little bit more familiar to all of us, this is how much can your monthly payments be? So if the other one was how much house can you buy, this is how much can you afford on your monthly payments? And the government looks at both of these factors when considering the limits on municipal governments. The service on debt limit is calculated at 0.25 times the revenue of the municipality. So a quarter of the revenue of the municipality is how much you could have as your sort of annual debt servicing limit. And again, you can see that number declined from 2019 to 2020 as the municipality's revenue was declining. So as I stated, as the municipality's revenue declines, so does debt limits. Budget 2022 proposes to increase revenue, and as a result, we can expect that Jasper's debt limits will again increase. And so we thought that it would be helpful to give council a little bit of a forward-looking view of the municipality's debt servicing from 2012, so prior, the past nearly 10 years, with a forward forecast based on the 2022 and beyond capital budget to show you what the municipality's debt servicing will look like over that time horizon out to 2052. So you can see here, the blue dotted line is 2022. And I like to, my first observation in making this chart was that it's appropriately mountainous for Jasper, given our setting. But the other big observation that I'd like to make early on, you'll remember that I mentioned that in 2020, our debt servicing limit was about $4.6 million. You'll notice that at no point between now and 2052, based on the 2022 capital budget that's in your package, at no point does the debt servicing increase beyond $2 million. So, we can see that the municipality is in relatively good shape. Certainly, there are additional competing demands in future years, and council will have to consider future capital projects that would change the shape of this mountain range. But it is important to note that the municipality is in good shape with respect to debt. You can see the principal on the bottom and interest payments on the top. And there are a few features of the mountain ranges that we might like to share with you. The first, you can see this peak comes from the addition of the Connaught Utilities wastewater treatment plant and the beginning of the activity center renovation project. And so that's what that peak is. It's followed that's what that peak in 2022 is. It's followed pretty closely behind. I'm sorry, and I'm missing a graphic there, by the expiration of some wastewater treatment plant loans that are being paid off, and so it declines. And then some additional wastewater treatment loans and the borrowing for the activity center renovation. And then the final borrowing for the activity center renovation and the expiration of the Connaught Utilities loans out towards the end of 2052. So this gives you a sense of how the municipality's debt is maturing over time. You can see that earlier on it was a bit more choppy, probably reflective of smaller borrowing over shorter periods of time, coming on stream and then expiring. Given the lifespan of assets like the Connaught utilities that we recently installed, they easily have a 40+ year lifespan, if not more like 80 to 100-year lifespan. And so we have reasonably, I think, extended the borrowing for those assets over a longer time horizon. And that's why you get a little bit more of the smoother shape over the future horizon. But altogether, I think that gives council a bit of insight. I hope that gives council a bit of insight into the municipality's debt profile. If there are additional information, we can certainly provide that. But municipalities are also required to provide our debt in our annual audited financial statements. So council and community see every year exactly how much debt is on the municipality's books and how it compares to both our overall debt limit and our debt servicing limit. Again, Your Worship, I'll just pause there, stop the share and turn the screen back to you if there are any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Wilson.
Just to clarify, that graph doesn't reflect any forecast of additional debt taken by future governments during that time. So in reality, it wouldn't just be on a constant decline.
That's right.
It kind of we'd be working in others, so it might be a little bit more mountainous.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Councillor Wilson. So this is, as I said, this is based on the borrowing that is proposed in the 2022 capital budget. Council of the day anywhere along there may choose to take on additional borrowing. So this is a dynamic chart. It certainly is not something that we expect to stay the same until 2052, as you rightly pointed out. But it is important as we head into the capital budget and council considering some significant projects, particularly the activity center renovation project, that council have some assurance about where that, if council approves that project, where it will put us in terms of our debt limits. And rather than waiting until the year end or having something that was just a fixed number, we thought that this look about how that debt profile will change and mature over time might be helpful.
Thank you for that. I see no other hands up.
Okay, Your Worship. Well, then maybe I'll move into the next section. Question that council and the residents and businesses often have is, how do my taxes compare to taxes somewhere else? And when making these comparisons, there are a couple of important things to note. First, we have to remember that municipalities all across Alberta are required to collect certain requisitions on behalf of other entities. In Alberta, this is quite common, and this is represented in your budget package. One of the easiest ways to see this in your budget package is in the tax inflow-outflow chart that is near the net tax requisition in your budget package. Just to describe this a little bit for people who aren't familiar with this type of chart, it basically shows the inflows on the left-hand side of the screen. And so you can see that the municipality collects approximately $15.6 million approximately in revenue from taxation. We collect about $6.2 million from revenue from utility charges. And then we have other revenue in terms of grants and user fees and other things for about $9.5 million. Altogether, that makes about $31.3 million in total revenue that is brought into the municipality. And we have about the same in, and I just want to note that my numbers don't completely add up. There's some rounding that's happening there. But we have approximately the same $31.3 million in expenses. The expenses on the right-hand side of the graphic show you municipal expenses in terms of our actual in-house municipal programs and services for community development, finance and administration, protective and legislative services, and operations and utilities. And then below them in sort of a green color, you can see money that goes out to entities that are not the municipality of Jasper. The largest of which is the $6.2 million that essentially funds the Alberta School Board Education Foundation. So the money that the municipality collects in taxation and forwards on to the provincial government to help fund the education system in schools in the province. The Evergreens Foundation number is actually very, very small, so small that it wouldn't represent well on this chart if we didn't roll it in. So it is actually rolled in there with the provincial government's school board revenue. And then there's also the Parks Canada revenue, land rent, planning and development supports and services for just under 700,000. And then there was the aforementioned municipal contribution to provincial policing that's there at 252,000. So this gives you a little bit of a better sense that although the municipality collects $15.6 million in taxes, the first thing that you need to do is take off at least $6.2 million of that, and actually more like $7 million of it to recognize that much of it goes off to entities that are not the municipality of Jasper. And that inflow outflow is an important consideration before anybody decides to compare taxes between municipalities. It's important for any resident to ensure that the number that they are looking at on their tax bill is reflective of the taxes that actually go to the municipality of Jasper, rather than the bottom line, which totals up the taxes and requisitions, and those requisitions that may go to others. The other item that is important for council and the public to be informed on is that municipalities may have different classes of residential and non-residential properties, and municipalities may allocate the tax burden between these different classes differently from community to community. In Jasper's case, we have 5 classes of property types. We have both urban and rural properties, and within the urban class of properties, we have both residential and non-residential properties. And non-residential is the technical term for commercial properties, but anything that isn't a house or a place where people live is non-residential, but commonly you'd think of that as commercial properties. We also have residential and non-residential properties in the rural area with their own contributions. And we also have the Lake Edith properties. And you can see there exactly how much each one of these property classes contributes to the $9.4 million net tax requisition. There was a significant amount of discussion. Sorry, I see Councillor Wilson has his hand. I'll pause.
Sorry, just looking for an example of the residential rural.
Thanks, Councillor Wilson. I think Ms. Melnichuk is on the line as well, and I would ask just for if she has an example of what might qualify as a residential rural property, because I don't know that off the top of my head. I can't.
Yeah, I have my own assumptions, and I think I have an idea of it, but I think for population in general, it might be a good question to answer, and it doesn't have to be answered now.
Sure. Ms. Melnichuk, if you're there, is that a question that you'd be in a position to be able to answer off the cuff like that?
Not off the cuff. I have to look at some of my spreadsheets to pull up that answer.
Councillor Wilson, we can find some examples of what would make up a rural residential property for you, and make sure that we present that during the budget. It is because
I suggest it's residential housing on some of the outer line commercial properties like Beckers or Pine Bungalows, etc. But don't hold me to that, but I would suspect that's what it is.
Well, your suspicion is probably right, but we'll make sure that we confirm that before we have the presentation tonight. But I think you're right that there are places that people live regularly, are not generating a revenue like a commercial property would be out there, but there is obviously municipal tax that's paid.
Councillor Demota.
Yeah, and similarly for rural non-residential, is that strictly hotels?
Councillor Demota, I know that would be at least in part hotels. The other portion would likely be linear properties, which are a class of non-residential, so essentially pipelines. The municipality does generate revenue from pipelines, and of course they're not homes. So those linear properties are probably reflected in the non-residential rural as well.
Excellent, thank you.
So,
Mr. Given, just before you go on, I had a related question, and it's not specific to the budget, but as I say, relates. Because you have allocated between those classes of property, all of the 9.4 million, I presume then that you are satisfied that you have relatively accurate assessments. And so the assessments are a year behind. So for 2022, we're dealing with 2021 assessments. And I'm just interested in what variation may have been seen in the last couple of years with respect to the comparable between residential and non-residential assessments. My recollection is that, at least for urban, it has been roughly equal, but because non-residential is on an income basis, I wonder just where we stand. But it appears that you've got numbers that you're relying on, or you couldn't have come up with the allocations that you did.
Yeah, Your Worship, that absolutely will change. We fully expect that we'll see that shift. Although thankfully, we won't be in the same position as some other communities. The most extreme example of this that has received the most media attention over the last couple of years has been downtown Calgary, where they have a high proportion of commercial property, where the revenue for that commercial property had been declining pre-COVID due to the long downturn in the oil and gas sector. So there were essentially less people renting space in downtown office towers in Calgary, and it really meant that they lost 20 to 30% of their revenue, of their assessment declined there. A couple of factors that are a benefit to Jasper are, first off, that the income approach typically uses what I believe is a 3-year rolling average. So it does tend to blunt those downturns somewhat. And then also, it will be interesting to see how long the impacts of COVID last. Obviously, we've seen a significant amount of visitation, and my at least anecdotal understanding from our colleagues at Tourism Jasper was that visitation was relatively high, that occupancy was relatively high in 2021, certainly cratered in 2020. And we certainly saw overall the amount of revenue coming into local businesses was different because we saw a different mix of visitor. And so it will be interesting to see how that actually turns out in assessments. But you're 100% correct that municipal property tax assessments are a trailing indicator. They're usually at least a year behind. But I think that there's a recognition that particularly in the hotel industry, there can be really wide fluctuations in revenue for hotel properties. And that's why the province has been using this 3-year rolling average. It does remain to be seen exactly what the impact will be in Jasper. And so that may be an issue that we will have to reckon with when it comes time to set the mill rates in the spring. But ultimately, it is another part of the complexity of making municipal budget forecasts.
Thank you for that. Any other questions for Mr. Given before he moves on? It appears not. So, Mr. Given, please proceed.
Thanks, Your Worship. I was still on the idea of municipal property tax classes. We did have in Jasper talked quite extensively through last council term about the tax ratio. The government of Alberta has directed municipalities to eventually come into compliance with what they were calling for a 5-to-1 ratio. And so the 5-to-1 number is that the province wished to see municipalities be no higher than a ratio of, for every $1 collected in property taxes from residential properties, that commercial properties should pay no more than $5 for every one of those dollars collected from residential properties. At council's direction, the municipality of Jasper has moved down from a 5.1-to-1, now down to 5-to-1. Budget 2022 assumes that same ratio. You'll see that we also have another item in our ratio just to add to the complexity and uniqueness of Jasper, and that's the Lake Edith properties. So we actually have a 5-to-1 to 0.58 ratio in Jasper because those Lake Edith properties, it reflects at least in a portion, it reflects the fact that they're not accessible or usable year round. They're really only accessible, usable for 7 months of the year, and they're taxed accordingly to that. So that's the tax ratios. the municipality of Banff, our colleagues in the other mountain park are still above a 6-to-1 ratio. And so budget for 2022 continues to move forward with the 5-to-1 ratio that Jasper Municipal Council set last year. Looked at slightly differently, this shows really the proportion of our revenue that comes from our urban non-residential properties. And so urban non-residential really is hotels in the Jasper context. And so nearly 57% of the municipal revenue comes from those commercial properties, followed closely behind with urban residential properties contributing under a quarter of our revenue. And then the rural non-residential or rural hotels contributing just under 16%. And then finally, those rural residential properties at 3.4% and Lake Edith contributing less than 1% of our municipal property tax revenue. So those proportions, I think, are something that's often of discussion in the community, and administration thought it might be useful context for council to see that as we head into the 2022 budget, to really understand where our revenue comes from in terms of our property tax classes. I don't see any particular questions, so I'll move on to the next area where to discuss other perspectives people might have about their property tax bill. And really the most direct way to compare one municipality's tax levels to another is to consider mill rates. Every municipality has to publish mill rates, which are essentially a part of a calculation that says, apply this by your home value, and you will see how much property taxes you have to pay. Every municipality has to publish these in bylaws on an annual basis. And so administration undertook a brief exercise to look at a number of comparable municipalities, 2021 mill rates, and see what it would look like on a property if the same property is located in different areas of the province. On the residential side, administration applied the mill rates to an $800,000 residential property. And again, just to be specific, this is municipal taxes only. This does not include requisitions like school board funding or any housing funding that any of these municipalities might have. But you can see that on an $800,000 residential property in Jasper, that property would pay just under $2,000 in municipal property taxes. Again, that homeowner may look at the bottom line on their tax bill and say, well, wait a minute, it's actually higher than that. And it would be because there are those requisitions that go to the province of Alberta. But in terms of the money that is contributed towards municipal operations, it's just under $2,000. Slightly lower in Banff, significantly higher in Hinton, and Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer. So there are 300 and some municipalities in the province. Administration wanted to take a sample. First off, Banff, of course, because they're also in a mountain park context and setting, and most often used as a comparator. Hinton, because it's geographically similar and although maybe economically quite different. And then Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer, because they are municipalities that many of our residents might be familiar with, either having lived there, moved there, or having businesses in those areas. So this is a comparison of an $800,000 residential property based on the 2021 mill rates in each of those communities. And administration did the same on a commercial property or non-residential property. In this case, we applied it to a $20 million evaluated property. You can see that in Jasper, that property would pay just under $250,000 in municipal property taxes. In Banff, it would be slightly more. In Hinton, it would be slightly less. Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer, it would be significantly more. In both of these cases, on the non-residential properties you see here, and in the residential property that you saw earlier, Banff is either somewhat below the median or significantly below the median on the residential side. But in both cases, certainly not at the top of the list in terms of the amount that a property owner of either a residential or non-residential property would pay in local government property taxes. Let's pause there and ask if there might be any questions.
Councillor Melnick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Gibbons, in the commercial, it talked about a $20 million property. That's $20 million in revenue as opposed to the property being worth $20 million on the books. Is that correct?
No, Your Worship, to Councillor Melnick, no, so that is a bit of a subjective number. It's the value of the property. So as we just discussed a couple of minutes ago, my understanding is that particularly for hotel properties, they are evaluated or valued on an income-based approach. And so that is the value of the property that would be supplied to the municipality that we would apply the mill rate to. And so we really just attempted to use a round number to give people a bit of a sense of scale. We could have chose a $10 million or a $40 million number, and the graph essentially would have looked the same. But my understanding is, as we discussed, that's on the municipal assessment, which is driven by a revenue-based assessment on that 3-year rolling average.
Great. Thank you for the clarification.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hall, I thought I saw your hand up. Go ahead if you can unmute.
Sorry about that. Just a little technical difficulty. Thank you, Mayor Ireland. My question is, do non-residential properties pay the same % out to Evergreens and policing in the schools? And would the other properties you compared us to, is that just the taxes they pay to their municipalities? And would they also have another additional tax they pay out to those same kind of organizations?
Your Worship, for Councillor Hall, so yes, they would all have their own amounts that they would pay out. The province of Alberta has, in some cases, varied their approach to the education requisition. Through COVID, the province has put a cap on the education requisition. And some types of properties are actually exempted, particularly linear properties or pipelines in some cases, or industrial properties are exempted from paying education property tax. But generally, if we're talking about a common non-residential property in Jasper, like a hotel or a commercial business, they would not be exempted. In each of those communities, I guess one significant difference would be Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer, and Hinton actually would all be communities, and Banff would all be communities that also pay their policing directly through their municipal budgets. So those communities would not have, so Banff, Hinton, Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Red Deer would not have an additional requisition for policing costs. And so their costs of policing would be built into their general municipal budget. And so they wouldn't be reflected with an additional requisition on top. But other than that, yes, I'm sure each of these communities would have a requisition for some kind of housing management body. Certainly Hinton is a part of the Evergreens Foundation. And so that they would have an Evergreens requisition applied in Hinton as well. And I know from experience that Grand Prairie is a part of the Grand Spirit Foundation. And so there's a Grand Spirit requisition levied there as well. And the other communities may have other types of requisitions that are not reflected in Jasper. But so these numbers are intentionally only reflecting the amount the municipality collects from property taxes to pay for direct municipal services.
Mr. Given, I just had a question about that last graph that you showed us, the non-residential comparison with other communities. Do you happen to know whether in Hinton, the mill is classified as non-residential as it would be in Jasper, or is that designated industrial, which therefore reflects something lower for their non-residential component? It's a small item, but in terms of comparison, I'm expecting that the mill is an awfully large taxpayer within Hinton, but may not be classified as non-residential the same way a commercial property in Jasper might be.
Your worship, without looking to be 100% certain, I'll hazard a guess that the mill would likely be a designated industrial property. A couple of years ago, the province instituted a system to bring more properties into this class. And what designated industrial properties are is they're a class of property that the province has specifically designated. So it's not a particularly inventive name, but they've specifically designated certain types of properties where the province is in charge of assessing the property and determining the value of the property through a highly regulated, an even more highly regulated property tax assessment approach, and where the province also is responsible for, has significantly more influence in setting the mill rate for those types of properties. So it is an effort of the province to ensure that large industrial properties are treated the same across the province, rather than having individual municipalities having an ability to have an undue influence on really large tax bills. That said, even though the province has more control and influence on designated industrial properties, I have no doubt that the mill would be, if not the largest, one of the largest taxpayers in the community of Hinton. Okay, Your Worship, if I may, I'll continue on with the presentation. Okay, Council, with the contextual remarks pretty much concluded, we'll move into the operational budget. And we did want to discuss briefly how the presentation you're seeing this year is different from previous years. And it really starts with these cute little dolls. The municipal budgeting is kind of a unique character, and as anybody who's done a business budget knows, you can break down a budget into very discrete, very small components. Municipal budgets are much the same. They have multiple levels of detail, with the smallest being wrapped up into a next larger unit, which can be wrapped up into an even larger unit, and so on. In our budget process, the largest unit is probably the net tax envelope, which gives you a sense of the operation of the municipality, the revenue and expenses of the municipality at this very high level. That doesn't really give council or the community very much information to decide what programs within that are getting resources and what the expenses are in which areas. So you could look down at the next level of detail, which is departmental budgets. And so rather than just representing the protective and legislative services on a single line, a departmental budget would take the protective and legislative services and break down its revenue and expense by program area. So you could see that there's a certain amount of revenue associated with fire and emergency measures, and there's expenses associated with the fire and emergency measures program. Again, that doesn't give you a particularly great level of detail, but it is obviously much better than the net tax revenue chart. The next level within the municipal budget would be to look at things at the service profile level. This was included in the council package. We are, as I mentioned before, progressing along a path where we will do more service profiles so that we get a more discrete understanding of individual programs. But a service profile starts to say, okay, so within community development, the Fitness and Aquatic Center, very specifically, what makes up the revenue and expenses of the Fitness and Aquatic Center? And so council can get a better sense of what that actually looks like in isolation, and really understand the costs and revenues of an individual service. There is a even finer level of detail in municipal budgeting, and this would be the operational level detail. This is, and if anybody really starts to get their nose on their screen, it's because that print is very, very small. This is the very detailed budgets that Ms. Melnichuk and our admin team and the managers have to go through. It includes the codes for each and every individual revenue line and expense line. And so things like postage for the fire department would be represented in this level of detail. And as I said before, administration's goal is to provide council and the community with information rather than just data. And so we could say that we're being fully transparent, but by providing council and the community all of the data, by going to an operational level of detail. But I think it's pretty clear that that would be challenging for council and community to understand all those different codes and different lines. So for this presentation, we're going to be working at the departmental budget level. And that's what we're going to be presenting this evening. And within those departmental budgets, we are open to questions from council, recognizing that you have the service profiles that are wrapped up in those departmental budgets. So on screen, we're going to be showing departmental budgets, and we expect that council members will likely have questions of administration based on the information that you saw in your service profiles. So we hope that that's a reasonable balance of 3 different levels of information provided to council and to the community. The net tax envelope, the departmental budgets that you'll see here, and then that greater level of detail in the service profiles that were a part of the council budget package and a part of this public budget agenda. And so with that, I think we're ready to move into the departmental budgets, but I did see that Councillor Wilson had his hand before I move on.
Just to clarify, when you suggest, or when you reference service profile, if I'm looking at I guess we're rolling right into it, but it's the description, the program list, planning assumptions. Is that the service profile? Okay, thank you.
Yes, yeah. And as I referenced before, you know, this is our first iteration as we move towards being able to do, you know, a little bit more refinement and ultimately scoring of the services and the service profiles. So you'll see that there are still a few areas where there are a couple of different discrete services wrapped up into one profile. We expect that we'll disentangle those going through into 2022 a little bit more. But absolutely, Councillor Wilson, you've got it right that the service profiles are the 50 some pages that were contained in council's budget package. Any other questions before we move on?
Councillor Demota.
Well, if we're diving into the individual departmental budgets, just to quickly cap the net tax envelope, and there's a reference in our proposed document here with a change from last year's, or what was approved in April. And the difference is about $190,000, $189,000, which is very similar to the policing requisition. I was just wondering if that was a coincidence or if that was directly attributed to that and how it's getting reported now.
Your Worship, for Councillor Demota, very keen eye. Yes, that is the vast majority of that is the policing requisition, that being the difference there. There was another smaller amount, but the vast majority of it is the policing requisition as you identified.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Your Worship, I don't see any other questions at this time. So, Council, this is really where we turn it over to you. You've certainly heard me speak quite a bit, so I will put on screen for you now the departmental budgets. And we'll start with the finance and administration. Excuse me, I'll just make sure I've got that up for you. With finance and administration, I know Ms. Melnichuk is here to be able to answer questions that you may have. I know that you have the service profiles, and now is the time for questions that you might wish to ask to get a better understanding of any of the service profiles or of the budget generally. I will note as we enter this area that the 2022 budget does not include any new, other than in the CAO's office, the budget does not propose any new administrative positions. The one exception being in the CAO's office, where we're proposing to house a policy and research coordinator. I'm proposing that that position would be dependent upon securing a grant through the municipal internship program. And then there's also another new position, which would be the municipal energy manager. That's a collaboration with the town of Hinton that was previously approved and supported by the past council. So those are the only two new regular full-time positions that administration is proposing in the budget. And you can see those reflected in your package and in the service profile for the CAO's office. But I will turn it back to you for any questions. And I see that I'm joined by Ms. Melanchuk, who is actually the one that has all the answers.
As I just wait to see hands, although you may have there, thank you. Might I inquire, Mr. Given, why you might house the proposed policy review coordinator in finance and administration as opposed to, for example, protective and legislative services? It just seems to me to have a natural affiliation with legislative services.
Sure, thanks very much, Your Worship. A part of that is reporting structure. So the position would report to me as the CAO. And a reason for that is that the municipal internship program is very specific. They're looking for interns to have the ability to interact with senior management in the municipality. They are essentially trying to give people an opportunity to experience what it's like to be in municipal leadership, municipal administrative leadership. And a part of the program application is really strengthened if you can identify that they get to work directly with the CAO and experience a number of different areas across the municipal organization, rather than giving the appearance that they're embedded within one part of the organization and potentially restricted in their ability to learn, sort of get a broad picture view of local government. So that desire to have that reporting to the CAO, or that need to have our application strengthened by having the position of reporting to the CAO, is why it's reflected in that area rather than general legislative services.
All right, thank you for that. And not to suggest that everything is in the name, but might that position also review legislation or bylaws in addition to policy? Because it seems to me that we have a deep need for both policy and bylaw review in our organization.
Yeah, Your Worship, absolutely. I think that, there is a very close linkage between policies and the bylaws that come as a result of policies. That would be a part of this position. But I also want to reflect, the intent of this is to ensure that we have the capacity to act on Council's recently approved policy review policy that identifies that we will be reviewing all of our policies over the course of the 4-year term. So there is a very specific piece of work and function that is generated by that policy direction from Council, and administration is proposing that this coordinator, if we're successful in receiving the grant from Municipal Affairs, would be an approach to delivering on that expectation that's set up by the policy review policy.
Thank you for that. Questions then from Council of Mrs. Melanchuk or Mr. Given? Councillor Waxer.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. In the spirit of seeking to understand, I wanted to ask I had 2 questions. One, which was, what are other revenues of own sources under taxation? I just wondered what other sources of funding would come into play there.
So, Your Worship, maybe I'll start off the answer to be supplemented by Ms. Melanchuk. So of course, you'll see that across different service areas, and it is a combination of a number of different sources of revenue, some which may only exist in one service area or another. And so it is a bit of a catch-all term for smaller revenue sources, and Ms. Melanchuk can speak to some of the ones that would commonly fall into that category.
And I wanted to say it was just more under the category of taxation that I was interested in.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Given, through Councillor Waxer. Those would be penalties or franchise fees, any kind of fines, permits and such.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And sorry, my second question was, under Finance and Administration, General Administration, there is a transfer of reserves of 1,700,000, and then under revenue, and then under contracted services, a 2 million transfer or expense. So I was just curious what those two pieces were.
Yes, thank you for the question. There's, with the change that has been occurring with the departments, Mr. Given has also gone on a different route with our capital repair, maintenance, and replacement. And rather than having them in all departments and seeing them individually, we've rolled them all up into the administration to keep it a little bit tidier, so that it's all in one area now. So that's the big change, because we had the expenses of capital repair and replacement going through the operating as well. That way you can just see it in one spot rather than getting confused by all of the different areas.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Demota?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, you know, and along that similar lines, just for clarification on the difference between transfer when it comes to reserve and transfer payments. Just for clarification, because when I was reading that, I'm looking at it going, okay, well, we're transferring of reserves of 500,000. So I'm looking at taxation, just period. This kind of translates through the whole document itself, because we have this in a lot of the tables going throughout. So so I'm looking at transfer payments of 73 or 7.3 million. Like why wouldn't that just, you'd subtract the $500,000 instead of having that in there? Are they two different things?
Your worship, through to Councillor Demota. When you see the transfer payments within, say, taxation, for instance, you would see also the transfer payments of the dollars going out to the requisitioning bodies, so Alberta School, as well as Evergreens and whatnot, and parks, as well as policing. When we see transfer payments in the other areas that we're going to see along the way, they are mostly, and not all the time, but mostly part of the reserve transfers. But there are some times that you'll see an oddball that it will be a little bit different. And it comes down to the system that we're using for classifying our general ledger account codes. It's a max coding system. So there are a few extra things. The list is long, but for us it's pretty general, but sometimes there'll be an extra one in there.
Okay, yeah, and I probably brought that up too soon. I should have waited till we were further down, because that is a different process when it comes down to taxation. So I apologize for that. I'm a little bit more clear on it, but I'll wait. And if it's still ambiguous to me down the road, I'll ask it again, and where it's a little bit more significant. Thank you.
Your worship, for Councillor Demota, I think you asked it at just the right time. Certainly in taxation, as Ms. Malinchuk said, that, you know, the bulk of the one on the taxation service profile is that requisitions, might be another term for it in that category. I think what Ms. Malinchuk was reflecting was a little bit of that fine level of detail in terms of codes, and there are a number of other items that are coded as a transfer payment within our administrative back-end financial system. When we're rolling them all up into the service profiles, you'll see that in some areas those smaller items show up there. We may in future years figure out a better terminology that's more descriptive, but in terms of this year, you'll see, as Ms. Malinchuk said, you know, you'll see the $24,000 here or some other smaller amount in another department, and they are really reflective of budget codes that were associated with that were similar to the transfers that we talked about in terms of requisitions. So it's it's a bit of a leftover and a bit of that translation between the detailed budget and the service profiles that is not as precise as we'd like yet.
Well, that, if I may, that makes more sense to me now, because when I was looking at it, I was thinking transfers to reserves and transfers from reserves. So, and that's why that was a little confusing for me, but transfer payments now, that's clarified. Thank you.
Your worship, if I may, the other item that I would point out to council, just to ensure, I did reference it in the presentation, but in the service profiles that are in the public budget document that council received ahead of time, under the finance and administration taxation is where you will see the declining application of the COVID recovery reserve. And so you'll see a line item on the revenue side in taxation called transfer of reserves. In 2021, it was $1.2 million. In 2022, it is at $500,000 and declines to $250 in 2023. And so that, you know, when people are saying, well, the most money or the COVID recovery reserve, how is that being applied or where is it being applied? And that is where you see that money coming in from that reserve savings account and being applied into our operational budget to reduce the overall impact of property tax increases.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Melnick.
Through you, your worship, to Mr. Given, over the 22 and 23 transfer reserves for the COVID recovery, will that deplete the reserves that we have, or will there still be a dollar amount left over for future use? And I'm assuming that part of those reserves are to cover a utility rebate program that currently is going to cover 2 budget years.
Yes, Councillor Melnick, and I believe Ms. Malinchuk has those details at hand. I would do them at the round number level. I can tell you that we have approximately $1 million. Administration is forecasting that we'll have approximately $1 million available in that reserve heading into 2022. Half of it we're proposing to apply in the 2022 year with that $500,000, and then a further $250,000 beyond that. That $1 million heading into 2022 is reflective of taking out, assuming that the $90,000 for the utility rebate program is fully utilized. So we've discounted that out of there already.
Thank you for the clarity.
Thank you. Councillor Demota.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt if you were going to go ahead and ask a question. I just, I had something here that was left over and I just wanted to address it.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. In the CAO office, the conditional grants of $111,000, I know you made reference to it. I just couldn't add up the numbers from the preamble that you supplied with the policy review coordinator, and what makes up the total of that 111?
Councillor Demota, thanks for the question. So the amounts in there, and I can get the specific amounts for you, but the categories that can comprise that are grants from the Municipal Climate Change Action Center that will be providing $64,800 towards the Municipal Energy Manager position. And also a share of revenue. So Hinton will essentially pay its share. So the municipality of Jasper will pay about $17,000. I would expect that Hinton would pay about the same. So Municipal Energy Manager would be the $64,800 plus approximately $17,000 from Hinton. That would be the income on the Municipal Energy Manager side. And then the Policy Review Coordinator position, Municipal Affairs provides municipalities with $60,000 if they're selected to host an intern, and administration is proposing to realize $30,000 of that revenue in 2022, and then the balance of that provincial funding in 2023. So that's where you see the $30,000 in 2023. So there is that combination of and conditional grant might not be exactly right when we're counting on another municipality to provide funding to us, but that's the combination of those 3 items: money from the province, or sorry, money from the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, money from the municipality of Hinton, and money from the province for the municipal intern is what totals up the $111,000.
Thank you for that. Mr. Given, to you perhaps, or through you to Mrs. Melanchuk, I'm not trying to jump ahead to the specifics of support for external groups, but does that funding live within the finance and administration department? Or is it split between this department and other departments? So for example, whatever the allocation of funds might be to external groups, where is it found within department budgets? Is it in this budget? That is finance and administration.
Your Worship, I can answer that. Actually, we have placed that under legislative and protective services. And it sits close to council in that it is council's decision on the amounts funding that will go to the organizations. Prior to that, it was split into various different locations. There was some that were under culture and recreation, and there were some under CFS. So we thought that it might be better to bring them all into one group and look at them entirely as one rather than all over the place with the budget. So that's where they've moved to.
All right, well, I appreciate that, and maybe that clarity was there and I just failed to find it, but I was looking for where they had found a home this year, and I'm happy to know that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions with respect to finance and administration department budget? I will ask one question, and then we can maybe move on. And I'm going to propose that this might be an appropriate time for a quick recess. Everybody probably needs a bit of a break. But Mrs. Melanchuk, for us and for members of the public, why is it that on the documents that we are presenting, revenue items are preceded with a minus sign and not so expenses, when that seems contrary to intuition?
Your Worship, it is an accounting way of doing the revenue and expenses. If council finds it confusing, then we could look at doing it a different way. It's just what I've been known to practice, and it's easier for me to look at. But if council requires, or if anybody else requires it differently, then we can look at presenting it differently.
Well, thank you. I'm not suggesting a change, just hoping to achieve clarity, particularly for a member of the public who raised the question with me, why are there minus signs when it's money coming in the door? But fair enough. I appreciate the answer. Councillor Demota.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm glad that question was asked, because I had that conversation a couple of times already as well. And when it comes down to the bottom line, and Ms. Madeline, I'm trying to say your last name wrong, because I often say it wrong. When I see a minus sign on the net surplus deficit on a number, I'm assuming that that's what taxpayers are going to be on the hook for. So I see that, you know, for an example, at the bottom of the budget summary under taxation, we have a positive number of 9.3 million there. But then when you scroll down to finance administration, the office of the CAO, there's a negative $298,000 there. So am I reading that correctly? That's going to be tax dollars, the contribution of tax dollars?
Yes, Your Worship, through to Councillor Demota, that is exactly correct. It is the amount that would be supported by the tax dollars, and the positive figure that you see in the taxation is some of the amount that would be covering those negatives that you see within the context of the budget. There are some budgets that will be in a surplus, however, not all. So that's, yes, you are reading it correctly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If there are not further questions at this time with respect to the Finance and Administration Department budget, I would propose that we move on, but before we commence with Protective and Legislative Services and Communications, we take a short break. I have now 7:40. Is 5 minutes sufficient for people? We can go back at 7:45, but you can have a quick break for now. So I will see you all back here in 5 minutes time. Thank you. I'm not sure that all are back. Otherwise, I would invite you to go ahead, Mr. Given, but I'll give other councillors a chance to appear.
My apologies for the delay.
All right, I think we are all back. Mr. Given was there a moment ago, so I will invite him to continue with Protective and Legislative Services.
Just working between screens and paper and mute buttons. I'm back. So our next area in your council package is the Protective and Legislative Services area. So I will share with you the departmental budget for that area. And again, recognizing that council members have the service profiles for the different programs within the Protective and Legislative Services area in your package. There are no new positions proposed for the Protective and Legislative Services Department in the 2022 budget year. But it is reflective of the integration of protective services, fire bylaw with our legislative and communications areas. So a bit of a different look than you would have seen in previous years. But administration is here to answer any questions that you might have about the service profiles or the details of the protective and legislative services that you read in your budget packages.
Councillor Melnick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through to Mr. Givens, I do see salary lines, and I just see that salary lines are pretty well consistent, except in one area. Under the communications, where from 2022 to 23, there's a $20,000 increase, and then from 23 to 24, a $22,000 increase. Is that, how could I best put this? Are salary adjustments all being reflected in just one page for the entire department, and as such would account for those increases?
Your Worship, for Councillor Melnick, thanks for the question. So the communications department, well, the communications department is actually probably the easiest way to see one small oddity of our approach to budgeting. And I say oddity, actually, and I shouldn't say that. One example of an approach that we're using to budgeting, and there are multiple ways, Councillor Melnick, as you of course know, to cut a budget and to sort of structure a budget. And we have historically used an approach that allocates some of the administrative burden, the administrative overhead, to each departmental area. And new in the communications area for 2022 is an allocation of the portion of the director's salary into communications. And so that's what that significant jump that you see between 2021 and 2022 is actually a reallocation of a portion of the salary for the Director of Protective and Legislative Services. You will also see portions of that salary reflected in the fire area and in the bylaw area, although not as clearly as you see it in the difference between 2021 and 2022 in communications, because that reallocation wasn't previously happening in the 2021 year, where fire and bylaw did have a director previously, and they were already paying a share of the director's salary. So that's what that one really is. It's just reflective of that reallocation of director salary. There is also a bit of a forward look as we go through the consolidation of the community and creation of the community development department. We're going to have a look through the 2022 year at corporate communications and our approach to that. We do have communications resources in other areas, and we will consider what that might look like going forward through 2022. But the biggest part of the number is the director's salary, approximately 30% of the director's salary being applied here.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Mr. Given, I have a question about the page on service profiles that council has, although it's not easily numbered, but it is page 17 of 56 on the electronic version. And at the
what is the service profile, Your Worship? What is the name of the area that you're looking at?
It says council and, or pardon me, Protective and Legislative Services Council, including Hakone in brackets.
Thank you.
And so I just want to confirm that the top line, transfer of reserves, $14,000, that would be an accumulation of $2,000 per year for the past years. And then offsets under the expenses where it says other allowances and fees for elected officials, there's a $16,000 number. And so my understanding is that each year there is an allotment for Hakone to give the opportunity if the opportunity arises. And so that's the connection. If councillors or the public are wondering, is that the connection of those numbers?
Yes, Your Worship. And so in this area, recognizing that the potential the travel to our sister city would be explicitly a council function, and that it could cause a really big variation in a single year, the administration does collect that into a bit of a fund each year. The other $2,000, the $2,000 annually, I believe, are reflective of technology costs for council and administration budgets for that over the course of the term, recognizing that most of the technology needs for council are upfront near the start of the term, but administration spreads that cost throughout the course of the term. So it really is that $14,000 is really reflective of sort of that increase of $14,000 in 2022 is reflective of administration putting away additional money in case council should choose to support travel to Hakone sometime in 2022 or 2023.
Thank you for that. And the following line item, contracted services for 2022, $51,200. That is, I take it, a budgeted amount for the potential that council may have need for contracted services. Is that an amount that is added to any accumulated surplus in that area, or is that the amount that council would have for contracted services for the year?
I just want to clarify your question, and I may need Ms. Melnichuk's support in answering it, Your Worship. When you say an accumulated surplus, those monies are not intended to be carried over year. If they weren't expended within that year, they would be a part of the overall municipal surplus or deficit. So I just want to clarify if is that what you're asking?
So Well, it may be. So typically we have some amount in the budget for contracted services, just because we may need it. If there was money that was unspent, is it simply gone? And so the entire budget amount for contracted services for the next calendar year for this council, is that amount shown $51,190?
Your Worship, thanks to the team, the 51,000 contracted services also includes travel for elected officials. And so in 2021, as reflective of the pandemic and at council direction, that number was reduced, recognizing that there weren't as many meetings and events for council to travel to. 2022 assumes a bit more of a normal resumption of council travel going forward.
All right, thank you. Other questions for Mr. Given, or through him to Ms. Nadon, who I see has appeared on our screens? Councillor Melnick.
Thank you, Your Worship. We have 2 pages under protective and legislated services, fire department, and also emergency disaster and ESS management. Budget numbers are the same on both pages. So the intent, I take it's there for information purposes. But we do have, it looks like, a budget for us to be able to conduct emergency training in the next year or two, and do our disaster preparedness within those budget amounts. And I'm assuming that again, the page is just a duplication for simplicity and looking at each page, but more importantly, planning for having a opportunity to do our disaster services exercises.
Go ahead, Ms. Nadon.
Thank you, Your Worship. I can speak to this one. Councillor Melnick, I believe a version of the package that you received earlier had the wrong table on that specific service profile. So the document that was published on our website and circulated to the public actually has the numbers. I would be happy to screen share if that helps the conversation instead of looking for that table. But so the numbers are quite different.
And Your Worship, I'll also remind Council that was the administrative error. Councillor Malek, if you're working off the hard copy that I handed out last week, we did update that late last week with some additions and some changes. And so as Ms. Nadon says, you'll see the fire and emergency measures and the emergency disaster ESS management tables are significantly different.
Thank you, and I appreciate getting the printed copy. This was one page where I missed. I did print out some other pages that for the benefit of having the hard copy in front of me, but I do have it now in front of the screen. So thank you very much.
Councillor Demota.
Thank you. I'd like to address some of the larger numbers for clarity under fire department itself. Just for revenue, where is the contribution that we get from Parks Canada in our agreement for service with them located? Is that under sales of goods and services?
Subject to being corrected by Ms. Nadon or Ms. Malinchuk, I believe that would show up under conditional grants. I think generally anything that we get from another order of government is reflected under the grants line.
Okay.
Even though it is actually a contract for service.
Okay. Right, and then, so if that, oh, sorry. I see that Ms. Malinchuk has her hand up.
Your Worship, through to Councillor Demota. Also, I'd like to point out that that actually is on the Fire Smart page, not on the fire fire protection itself. So it's on the actual Fire Smart page. The conditional grant from Parks Canada.
Well, what about the emergency contracted services for like the highways and things like that? That's part of it?
Okay, yes, there is a portion on there as well.
Okay.
And that falls under, yes, the conditional grants, but there are two different areas in which they contribute to. So there's the one that, yes, it's part and parcel of the protective services or the fire protection. And then there's also the Fire Smart.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The other two under expenses, if I may. Contracted services, the expenditure contracted services, what attributes to that 300,000 plus?
Your worship, and again, I should pause and let Ms. Nadon or Ms. Melnichuk answer it, but I believe that a significant portion of that is likely the brigade. The municipality has a contract with the brigade that is in the area of approximately $300,000 from my memory. And so I believe that that may reflect that. And again, this shows my willingness to be vulnerable. I'm happy to be corrected with additional or different information if either Ms. Nadon or Ms. Melnichuk have it. But my recollection is that that would largely reflect the brigade numbers. Ms. Nadon?
Thank you, Mr. Given. So yes, the brigade, I believe, is one of the items, and the amount is not quite so high, but it is a good portion of the amount you're seeing. Also, something worthy of noting is that our training officer currently is paid through contracted services. So we have someone who happens to live in Jasper and have the qualifications to fill that position, and they are filling it on a contractual basis. So there's dollars going there. And there's also that item that you're seeing is an amalgamation of different contracted services. So for example, equipment certifications for the fire department is something that we spend a healthy amount of money on annually to make sure our equipment is up to date and certified. And yeah, so a good part of it is the brigade, but then also our training officer and an amalgamation of other contracted services. Janitorial is one, I believe, as well. And so altogether coming up to that amount.
I really appreciate that, and I didn't mean to catch anybody offside. And then just the other one was the transfer payments there. Is that something that we're paying out for to another to the province or to Parks Canada?
I think that's a question for Ms. Nadon or Ms. Melnichuk. Ms. Nadon?
Yes, thank you. Subject to being corrected by Mrs. Melnichuk, who is the budget wizard. It's mostly towards our own reserves. So it's going towards restricted reserves, and fire trucks is mostly what we purchase with that. But also there's two separate transfers, one for our physical assets like the buildings, but the fleet is a big piece of protective. And you'll see on the capital plan that we have some big purchases in coming years. And so we're putting money away for that.
Okay. I guess this is kind of where I was getting confused, but I'll let others speak and then or ask questions, and then I'll see if I can clarify it in my own mind. Thanks.
I saw your hand there, Councillor Waxer, but if I might interject, just because we're on this subject, Mr. Given, to you or through you to Ms. Nadon, I recognize that transfer payments is most likely transfers to reserves. But this is the only place I think within all of the service profiles where I saw internal transfers. So can somebody describe to me what is meant by internal transfers? Mrs. Melnichuk can. I saw her nodding. Of course she can. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Those ones are actually the transfers to pay other staff for their services within those facilities. So you'll see that there are maintenance, for example. We speak about this quite often. Maintenance covers and goes into, say, the fire department and services the area, the arena, the pool, everywhere. So there is an allocation that is taken by the amount of service that they provide that has gone to the maintenance department, say, to cover the salaries and benefits that are incurred by that department. You might also see that in an area for janitorial, say, if a janitor is hired in one area but is also working in other areas, then you can see that transfer to cover it.
So if I may then, compared to earlier iterations of our budget, that might have appeared as reallocation of expenses.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Waxer, sorry to keep you waiting.
Thank you. It isn't even a question. I just wanted to express appreciation that to see emergency, disaster, and ESS management broken out as a separate category. I think it's absolutely critical that we put effort and energy into emergency planning. And just so I think having its own category gives me great reassurance. So thank you.
Your Worship, maybe I would just point out a couple of other highlights in this area and recognize the Council may have additional questions, certainly not to cut those off. But if you look at the FireSmart service profile, you'll see that the amount of conditional grants will be going down in 2022. That's a recognition that the municipality of Jasper has been very successful in receiving funding from FRIA over the last number of years. And it is time for us to take a little bit of a break from applying for FRIA funding. And so there's a decline in those conditional grants, and so therefore a decline in the contracted services. This doesn't reflect any reduction of the importance of FireSmart in the municipality, just a reduction in that grant. We will have to consider what that looks like in years beyond 2022, and that would be a discussion that we'd have with Council going into the 2023 budget process, but that would maybe be on Council's minds. And another area that I wanted to highlight, because it will be a discussion topic, certainly as a discussion topic in the community, is that there is a service profile around parking in the Protective and Legislative Services Department. So that is where you will see the reflection of administration's forecast of the contribution of paid parking in the 2022 municipal budget. I recognize that this is somewhat preemptive of Council's decision on the future of the program, and it is also preemptive of in advance of Council receiving that final report. But again, recognizing that administration needs to make some forecasts around the budget, we wanted to give Council and the community some early indication of what we expect to see. And you'll see in the planning assumptions on that service profile some early indication of what administration will essentially and will ultimately be recommending to Council in our final report. We will recommend that Council maintain on-street paid parking in priority areas. We'll recommend that we extend paid parking into municipally owned parking lots, that we extend paid parking to be a year-round service, and that we exempt residents from paid parking on some kind of basis. And exactly what that exemption would look like would be to be determined, but a very common consideration that has come from the public and from our parking provider would be that residents be exempted for anything other than long stays in the downtown core, because we do still want to manage a very valuable resource in terms of parking in priority areas, but we do not want to prevent or add additional cost to residents who are simply doing errands in the downtown core. So administration has heard those comments, and we're going to reflect those back to you in the paid parking final report. But recognizing that it's our responsibility to do some forecasting of budget, we wanted to reflect to Council what our financial assumptions would be around paid parking. The other item that I wanted to highlight there is that administration would expect to move in to begin ticketing in 2022 around parking. As council knows from our regular updates, administration did not issue tickets except in very extreme circumstances. So there wasn't anything more than a handful, probably less than 20 or 15 tickets issued in all of the during the entirety of the pilot project. Administration proposes to continue to take a light hand to ticketing. The intention here is not to generate revenue through tickets. It is to generate revenue through parking charges, absolutely, and to generate that revenue explicitly from visitors. And so that's what the budget reflects. Administration is forecasting that we would only ticket in about 25% of the possible occurrences. So out of 100 instances where administration could issue a ticket, we are basing this budget around the idea that we would only issue 25 tickets out of those 100 opportunities to do so. It's a bit of an awkward thing to discuss because we certainly don't want to be seen to be basing our budget on ticket or fine revenue, but there is a fact that tickets do generate some revenue, and administration has a responsibility to try to reflect that in the budget. But you can see under our planning assumptions that we really are explicit in our intention to allow our officers to have significant discretion, to be a welcoming environment, and to approach paid parking with a compliance first approach, where they have the ability to waive tickets if necessary, to maintain good relations with our visitors. But I felt compelled to bring the parking profile to council's attention so that you can see that administration does expect the potential of bringing in over $500,000 in revenue in 2022, increasing to just under $800,000 in 2023, and then ultimately to $1 million in 2024 if council accepts and approves the continuation of paid parking and the administrative recommendations that we expect to deliver to you in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. On the topic of tickets, are we able to, or are bylaw officers able to ticket moving violations? Are we, just out of curiosity, and how much, is it a big amount of revenue that comes in from not parking tickets, but other tickets? I'm just curious, and I'm noticing that we're paying 30% more to our police force. Do we collect any of their tickets? Seeking to understand is what I'm doing here.
Sure, Councillor Hall, and again, happy to be supported by either Ms. Nadon or Ms. Melnichuk. But at this time, our enforcement officers do not have the appropriate delegated authorities to issue speeding tickets and other moving violations like that. They do have appropriate training to be able to do so. But until council makes an explicit decision that we wish to apply that authority and make an application to the province, we don't have the ability to issue those kind of tickets. And that means that the revenue is not reflected in our budget. Also on the RCMP side, because in the province's system, unless you're a municipality that enters into contract policing, you don't get a share of any ticket revenue for tickets written by the RCMP. So the short answer is very little in ticket revenue reflected in the bylaw department's budget as a result of the fact that they don't have that level of authority bestowed upon them by council. And so that would be an explicit council decision if we wish to enter into that area of enforcement.
On roughly that same topic, Mr. Given, on page 22 of 56, that is the bylaw page of the profile, to you or through you to Ms. Nadon or Mrs. Melnichuk, there is a significant decrease in sales of goods and services shown between 2021 and 2022, approximately $126,000. Does that just appear somewhere else in the budget documents? I can't imagine that we're missing out on that sort of revenue somewhere, but can someone explain how that works? Ms. Nadon, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I believe you're right. It's that revenue was previously showing under bylaw enforcement and is now showing under parking. And something to note as well is that the S block parking lot rental fees have also moved to the new parking service profile. And the estimates are changing going forward to 2022, but I do believe that's why you see a decrease that's so significant. It was, the revenue was simply moved somewhere else.
Is it therefore fair to say that the net revenue of $445, almost $446,000 includes, say, that $126,000 that we had that disappeared? That is, it was there in 2021 and now it's not on the bylaw page, so it must be included in that 445.
I believe that's the case, but Mrs. Melanchak could confirm.
Yes, that's correct. So previously the amount for the paid parking, you would see that in 2021. And it was budgeted, say, just for the paid parking itself around 100,000. So then it was moved. So the difference would have been, if you had moved it down to 2021 on the parking, you would see the difference there. But because it was in bylaw before, we kept it in there to represent that it was there before.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Other questions then for protective and legislative services, service profile or budget? Councillor Demota, is your hand up there?
No,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Your Worship, if there weren't other questions on this service area, then we could move to the next. If council is ready to move on.
I think so, yes, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Your Worship. So the next area is a new area, community development. So this is the combination of the community and family services and the culture and recreation areas combined into one. There will be some significant change through the course of 2022. There may be some additional refinement of the structure and roles as we go through the course of the year and as we bring a new director on. But in front of you on screen, and hopefully that print is not too small, is the detail, the departmental level detail of the programs and services that are in this quite significant department. I just also want to say and acknowledge to council and the community, council, you initially were provided a package that was missing 3 service profiles. And so I appreciate that you've only had as long as the community on Friday till now to see the full package. My apologies for that error in production in the first round that council received early last week. But this package that was published in the community to the community in the agenda was the complete package that had those missing service profiles. So we open it up to any questions. I'll be supported by Ms. Melanchak, as well as 3 of our managers from the former CFS area. And I believe between the 4 or 5 of us, we should be able to handle at least some of the questions that were handled by the 2 former directors.
Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. Just out of curiosity, I'm seeing on the established positions page, there's 2 settlement workers. I know we've only had 1. I'm just curious how that is.
Yes, thanks very much, Councillor Hall, through your worship. So The fact is that Jasper was previously funded for a single position, but we were constantly exceeding the number of cases and the amount of newcomers that position was intended to support. So the federal department that funds this position identified that, and in collaboration with the department, identified that there was actually enough work to be able to actually fund additional settlement service workers here in Jasper, because the numbers were just at such a high level. We see that the permanent resident population has increased, and we also see a number of newcomers transitioning to permanent resident status. And so we had that great opportunity to reflect the actual demand in the community, and our funders recognize that Jasper is a community that has a significant amount of in-migration and newcomers arriving, and more so than I think was expected originally. And full credit to the department for advocating for that additional funding to reflect the actual demand in the community. Are there any other, Your Worship, I'll just ask again if there are any other questions for administration on the community development budget. Your Worship, I think I saw Councillor Waxer might have had a question.
Go ahead, Councillor Waxer. If you do, I didn't see your hand. I apologize.
Again, not a question, but just expressing the fact that I'm very interested and excited to see the new federal announcement on childcare and the agreement between Alberta and the federal government on childcare. I think that will make a tremendous difference in our community, and I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Waxer, for highlighting that. You know, one thing that I will say is that the budget was not certain whether the federal government would ultimately come to conclusion with the province of Alberta, where we are certainly happy to see that for the community. At this time, it's still a little bit unknown about how that will affect the operations. Certainly, our initial understanding is that that will be a direct benefit to the users of the childcare services, so the daycare, which will be a welcome relief, but is not likely to decrease municipal expenses. We'll also likely see the utilization of the service increase as more people are able to afford it. So obviously a positive outcome for the community, not yet fully reflected in the municipal budget. And we should also acknowledge that the full intent of the federal and provincial governments is to reduce the cost for users, not the overall cost for municipalities. So, you know, I think we'll have to look at that as it matures through 2022 and as more of the details become clear. It's certainly good news.
Councillor Demota and then Councillor Melnick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Given. Something just clicked in when I was looking at that $30,000, $31,000 revenue for gateway and sport camps. Now that we're focused on this, and you know, I see that it with the revenues potentially increasing in the next few years, the bottom line doesn't seem that high to me, and I'm trying to factor in what. And I'm not going to ask for the numbers now, but you know, the capital costs of what we're going to need to do to facilitate some of those camps as far as housing goes. And I know it shouldn't be talked about here, but I want to have a discussion with council on whether we should be in providing that service. I know that hotel rooms and other accommodation in the summer times are hard to get, but I'm not sure that we should be in the business of supplying accommodation for visitors. And, you know, our activity center isn't a hostel. And I think that the cost is going to be less than break even we roll all that out and what we need to do to provide that. So I'm not sure. It's not that I think we should get away from hosting sports camps, but as far as facilitating overnight guests, we might have to look into that and see what the overall financial contribution is going to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Devoto. Councillor Melnick, and then Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through to Mr. Given and potentially Mrs. Malinchak. I see we have our arena back and operating, and last year, 2021, we did not have a lot of tournaments in the springtime. And I'm just looking at the revenues for the arena, and my question is that the page where I would see revenues from hockey camps for spring and fall, so winter and spring and fall and winter of 2022? It seems like revenues are down in the arena, yet we had a period of time where we couldn't operate the arena and we didn't have sport camps. Is that on, am I looking at the right page for increases in revenue there? Or is it included in another page, such as I see the increase in sales of goods and services at the Fitness and Aquatic Center?
Your Worship, I see that Ms. Malinchak is here to be able to give some additional details. I don't believe that there'd be a crossover between Fitness and Aquatic Center revenues and the arena revenues, but Ms. Malinchak can reflect to you, Councillor Melnick, where that is and why that revenue of other sources, of own sources, is the way that it is.
Yes, so I apologize. I'm having some technical difficulties. My spreadsheet has gone blank here for a second. However, arena is in arena. There's no crossover in the departments, and you're seeing, I wish I could see it, a decrease in the revenues in the arena is what you're speaking to?
Yes.
Am I correct?
In 2021, revenues of own sources, some 245,000. But in 2022, 2023, and 2024, other revenues are lower than 2021.
Yes.
If we've missed a possible revenue line.
No, we haven't. It's based on realizing that, you know, we're actually not going to be able to come up to speed with what we had projected in 2021. So we've brought it down a bit for 2022 because of COVID. It's just not, things aren't coming back to normal as quickly as we were hoping they would.
So a more conservative rather than aggressive approach to the revenue, which is
yeah, slightly, yeah. We've reduced some line items, yes.
No, absolutely appropriate. If that's where we are in 2021, we weren't able to achieve those revenues. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Wilson, I think I saw your hand earlier.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump back to what Councillor Demoto was talking about with the Gateway and sports camps. I'm concerned that we're even offering dorms, but that might not be the place to say it here. I'm also concerned that we're allocating like very limited space in our facilities for dormitories. We've had the discussion that there are not even enough offices for staff. We're hiring 2 more staff that will need offices. And as it is now, the dormitories are not up to par. We shouldn't be offering places to stay. And so we may be okay offering sports camps, but of course they shouldn't be staying on our premises overnight. I don't support that. But also, I'd like to know how much money is being allocated to renovate this, because I think that is going in the completely wrong direction. I don't think it has council support. So this is a conversation I think we have to kind of unpack a little bit more. and maybe reallocate renovation monies to administration. You know, that conversation I think has to be had before we can support what's in front of us here. But I won't get into it much further, but I just wanted to bounce back and touch on what Councillor Demona started.
Your Worship, if I may, you know, I think Council highlights exactly the reason that we need to identify, you know, and go through the party-based budgeting process. This is an example of a program that is a long existing program in the community, and there may have been a justification for it at some previous point. If it no longer fits with Council's priorities for whatever reason, then that would be the opportunity for us to, you know, have that discussion based on Council's strategic priorities and our assessment of this program. And so that is absolutely within the Council realm, and administration would expect to provide you enough information and an evaluation of this program and how it fits with the priorities that you establish on the operational level. On the capital side, administration is aware that at minimum, if we are going to have anybody using that, whether it's for offices or for out of school care or any other function, there will need to be some improvements that are made down there in terms of fireproofing. But it's certainly a message received by administration or from my part that there's a concern about risk and about safety. We absolutely understand that, and administration is of the same view. We can have a bit more of a detailed discussion when we go through capital budget tomorrow night. I've flagged this, and so we'll be prepared to have a little bit more of a discussion about in the activity center renovation, what portion of that renovation really applies to our ability to host overnight visitors versus what are things that we need to do if we have anybody working in that space during the daytime. But I appreciate the perspective, fully support Council being able to have a discussion about this service and to be able to do that in an informed way, because if we decide not to offer the service, as you can see that there really are only a portion of some people's wages supported here. The next question would be, well, where would we reallocate that effort? On what other would be higher priority items if it wasn't this. All worthwhile discussion, absolutely. All fair game for Council, and administration would be able to hope to be able to support Council in doing that in a systematic way that identifies, you know, whether this does or does not fit with Council's vision of the types of services that they want to offer the municipality. And again, on the renovation side, happy to have that discussion as we get to the capital. Appreciate that there's a linkage between the program offering and the capital. There absolutely is. But during the capital discussions, we can highlight to you how much the renovations are explicitly for allowing that site to be overnight accommodation. And I think it's actually relatively small.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Demona?
Well, you know what? I kind of triggered on it a little bit because, and maybe we'll get into the capital, get more into it in the capital discussions, because I think that there should be opportunities for repurposing. We do have a lot of challenges. I don't know if I want to stick people with offices down there. There's not a lot of sunlight during the day, but you know, for the amount of time some of those spaces stay vacant year round, and that we could, you know, either make some revenue, or, you know, if we're not going to make revenue, at least let them be purposeful for either the community or the municipality. I know that we're challenged with a lot of storage space down there, but then there's also a lot of groups and clubs that are looking for places to rent or host events or do things. So, you know, by having those sit vacant and they do need some addressing as far as, you know, getting up to code on in various areas, but we have an opportunity that we could provide something for the community and the municipality there. And I'm tired of seeing those spaces being wasted. And, you know, whether, you know, there's two people playing racquetball in the community, we shouldn't have racquetball courts or squash courts if they're not, you know, sorry to the people that do use them, but there aren't, you know, for the amount of time that vacant space is there, it should be used for something more purposeful. Thank you.
Thank you. On that particular issue that started with sports camps and dormitory housing, is there a role for the health and safety position that we're hiring to give us advice on the appropriateness of of dormitory housing there, or is that something that is out of scope for that intended position?
Thanks for the question, Your Worship. I'm sure that they would be the type of resource that could go and track down that type of information, but I think it is somewhat out of scope. They really are focused on municipal operations and the way in which our staff are delivering, their services, going about their work day in and day out. Having said that, I'm sure that somebody that is in a health and safety position would know where to go and look. There are also provincial regulations that our architectural team and consultancy team can help us with as we go through the activity center renovation. If we told them, through the course of the project, these need to be built to be able to host overnight accommodations, then through that capital project, they would identify the rules and regulations that would apply to overnight accommodation. If we said these do not need to be overnight accommodations, and they would give us that advice. So I think the majority of the advice would come from people other than the health and safety coordinator position, more likely to come through our consultants that we bring in on the activity center renovation project.
Thank you. If I might ask then a couple of questions about the budget for community development. On the childcare services page, which is 33 of 56 on my agenda, there is an expectation of transfers of reserves of 130,000 this year, and then that disappears in subsequent years. And the bottom line, I presume, is a deficit, although it's missing the minus sign, but I truly believe it is a deficit. So that grows in 2023 by about $80,000 and then stays at that. So the transfers that are coming in now, is that transfers from COVID relief or other reserves with respect to daycare that council allowed previously, but is unlikely to continue? Is that why that line item disappears in the future?
Thanks, Your Worship, for the question. I know that Ms. Daniel is on with us this evening as well. And so I would invite her to join us. I don't think we're making any assumptions about what council will or won't approve in the future, but Ms. Daniel can certainly give us the details on the transfer of reserves line item and what contributed to that in 2021 and in 2022, and then why it stops going forward into 23.
Sure. Mrs. Malinchuk maybe can answer this a bit better, but I'll do my best. The 75,000 in 2021 is the most, is COVID relief. So you're right, Your Worship, that's what it is. And that's what most of it is in 2022 as well. And I think the main reason for that is so that we can keep fees where they're at right now for parents and not increase them. So that could change now with the $10 a day agreement. I think the biggest thing I can say is that there's going to be a lot of changes with the childcare budget in probably the next couple of weeks. So I would say that that's not guaranteed, but that's what it is now, if that answers your question.
Well, maybe. I understand that in a state of flux. It's a difficult time to be presenting a childcare services daycare budget when we've just had the announcement of $10 a day daycare and we don't know what the implications will be. So point taken. In terms of planning assumptions on this service plan, what are the assumptions made with respect to capacity for the coming year? Are we at full capacity now, or are we restricted still because of COVID, and what is anticipated going forward?
So we're not at capacity for the facility. We're at almost capacity for staff currently. We have 2 staff on mat leave, so those 2 positions haven't been refilled. So right now I would say we're at almost capacity for staffing, but we're not at capacity for the facility. I do foresee, like Mr. Gibbons said, our enrollment increasing in January, February, if we do go to half price, which is what the government is suggesting will happen in early 2022. So I can see our numbers increasing. We do have 1 staff returning in January for maternity leave, so that could help us out with being able to accept more children at that time. But we would have to have staff to accept more children as well. But right now we're about 50 children a day and we can take 76.
Okay. Thank you for that. Councillor Demoda.
Well, I'm glad we kind of shifted gears and gone this route and started talking about CFS branch support. So this is something that I've always kind of alluded to when we had the CFS. I don't know if this is going to come up. Well, you can't see it on my writing on there, but I went and added up all the expenses of this area, of this branch, and it's almost $3.4 million. And the taxation dollars that are proposed to be requisitioned are only $549,000, $550,000. So when I look at this, I look at it as an overall package, right? I want to take away the stigma of what it actually costs for the community to contribute to children going to daycare. So, you know, I like to say, like, for a 16% investment with the overall package of services are available to the community through here, we're getting 84% return. No other department has that, you know. So I think that regardless of the $10 coming in, if we can find a way to you know, keep that to the benefit of the parents and stuff, I think the better off we'll be, and we could just leave all this alone, because it's just, to me, it's a drop in the bucket for the amount of service the community is getting. Thank you.
Your Worship, if I may, the other planning assumption in the childcare area, you know, we didn't see the provincial federal fastball coming, which is great news for the community, as we reflected before. But administration is still working to bring forward in 2022 a community childcare strategy, which means, you know, certainly the municipality of Jasper, it is a challenge for the municipality of Jasper to meet all of the childcare needs of the community. There may be other opportunities to meet those needs, other players that might wish to be involved. And at this stage, we don't know those players necessarily. We don't know what the barriers might be, but council through the COVID Recovery Reserve did supply funding in order to enable administration to work through developing a community childcare strategy. We would expect that strategy, you know, now will have to account for the new provincial federal relationship and the $10 a day childcare service. Because I think, as Ms. Daniel said, it's likely that there will be increased demand, and it's not known at this stage whether the municipality alone could meet that increased demand in the community. And so I think the community childcare strategy will take a different tone, but will be no less important going forward in 2022. And so that'll be an interesting piece of work that will come out of this area through the course of the year, and will ultimately influence the 2023 budget and beyond.
Thank you for that. Are there other questions then for community development? Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. I just have a question back to childcare. With the announcement of money, would there ever be an option of opening our facility on Saturdays?
If the need is in the community, we definitely could look at that. I know that we have in the past, and there was a need there, but not enough to warrant staffing for a Saturday, Sunday. But that's not said that we couldn't do it again, like poll the community and see what's available. The small amount I know about the current agreement, it would encompass 7-day-a-week childcare. They're also doing overnight care in some communities that require it for shift work. So that would be available for the $10 a day or half price in 2022.
Just additionally, reflecting back to some of those sort of global factors that I mentioned, one of the constraints on our ability to expand service would obviously be the availability of human resources and staff. And so that would be one of the essential elements that administration would have to consider before we really move forward with expanding the service, would just be how realistic is it that we'd be able to identify enough staff to fill all the possible slots that the community might have a need in. And again, that's why that community childcare strategy would be so important. Part of that work would be to identify what the needs of the community actually are, what the demand is, and then you would be able to plan services around what the identified demand is. That certainly is the goal that we've set out in doing that, and we would hope that that would be able to influence the services the municipality offers, and if there might be other opportunities to meet the community need through delivery of childcare services that aren't necessarily through the municipality. I've heard anecdotally that there are others that might be interested, and certainly we see lots of different forms of childcare in other communities. And so those are all the types of things that would be investigated through that strategy.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
I'd just like to touch on the outside groups like Jasper Artists Guild, Habitat for the Arts, well, I guess the Municipal Library, and a few of the other, like the external groups. Where are their asks represented? And I feel a bit uncomfortable incorporating them into our municipal budget without them being highlighted or kind of broken out, because it looks like under community development we have library, Artists Guild, the arts, the Association of French Canadians, yet Jasper Victim Services is elsewhere, as well as what else? But anyway, I'd like to put numbers to those because I don't think we definitely haven't approved their asks, and so I think we do need that as a breakout, and so we can have those discussions on our own.
Yeah, Your Worship, if I may, to Councillor Wilson's question. So first, I'll just say you're 100% correct. The presentation, when we get there, does have those as the requests that were made from community groups to council at the Committee of the Whole recently. They're reflected as individual discrete decisions. So council, I would expect the council would give direction to administration of which of those to include in the final 2022 budget. And so there will be individual decision points made on that. The service profile that you're referencing that looks at, says that identifies key programs as being the Municipal Library, Artists Guild, Habitat, and ASIAFA, is actually the facility itself. And so that's why it's such a small number, and that there are some salaries assigned to it. This really isn't the transfer of funds out to external groups. It's the cost of having the library cultural center. And so it really is more about the facility. So this is a service profile around the building and the facility. And we only have there are a couple of examples of that. We also have one for the ops building, and a couple of others where the building itself has a service profile. But so the one you're referencing was the building itself. And I believe the community group funding, and Ms. Malinchuk can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the community group funding is actually reflected more in the protective and legislative area, recognizing that community group funding is a decision of council. And so it's more closely aligned with the legislative area and council decisions rather than internal delivery of culture and recreation. It's an external grant out.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Ms. Malinchuk, can you just clarify, because that did come up earlier, can you clarify where, in which of the service profiles we would see the community group external funding to external community groups?
Right, yes, it is part of the legislative and protective services, and it would follow council. You can see it on, it wasn't included the same way as the profiles because we wanted to discuss it separately. So it's definitely in there with council but it's not tied directly into council. It's separate on its own. However, because we were going to talk about it differently, we didn't have it into the actual package with a profile.
So your worship and Ms. Melnick, so council would see that reflected in the departmental level revenue and expense, or the expenses at the departmental level.
Yes.
But because it's a discrete decision and not a direct program of the municipality, it doesn't have a service profile per se.
And so if I might muddy the waters, because I think that has been relatively clear, but I just in terms of process for tonight and tomorrow, community group requests are a line item on our agenda, and it happens to be the next one. So the intent of administration was to get through the operational budgets, which, as I understand it, are premised on the acceptance of the requests that have been made. So those are embedded now in the budget, and then council will have to confirm whether or not it is council's desire that they stay embedded in the budget. So they're worked in already, as I understand, but they will come forward at the next agenda item as a discrete request for council consideration. And I had hoped that we might conclude on that subject tonight, but I think we have barely time to get through the operations part of the operational budget before 9 o'clock. So I'm going to propose that we commence that now and see where we get. And if we run a little over time, that's fine. And then tomorrow we can commence our session with the community group requests and then continue to the utility budget review and the capital budget review tomorrow night, if that all sounds workable to everybody. So I appreciate the question, Councillor Wilson, and hope to get to it first thing tomorrow, unless we have to wind up operations tomorrow.
I guess
so
I should have read the agenda.
I think we had exhausted questions on community development, but I won't say that with certainty. I'll allow any councillor who has an outstanding question with respect to community development, and I see Councillor Demota does, and then we will turn to the operations department budget.
I don't mean to take up much time, but just to add some levity to it, I think that we should go through a process like we did for Centennial or Commemoration Park. I don't like the name of this area. Community development doesn't sound like something that this whole thing encompasses. So I think we should have a contest to see what it should be named. Anyway, just throwing it out there for fun. Let's get on to the next thing.
All right. That is an invitation, Mr. Given, to proceed with the operations part of the budget.
Invitation accepted. Thanks, Your Worship and Councillor Demota. So the operations budget at the departmental level is in front of you. This is essentially a straight line budget, other than typical cost increases, reflecting an expectation that there'll be some increase in expense as related to increased cost of goods and labor. There are no new positions being proposed in the operations area in 2022. Administration does have a desire to undertake an exploration of whether or not we might be better served to reduce our expenditure on external contractors by potentially hiring some in-house trades people. But that is not being, to be clear, that is not being proposed in 2022. We would expect to undertake that exploration through the course of 2022 so that we're in a position to present council with a solid and well-defined business plan that would demonstrate the net sort of benefits to the municipality. But so that is one of our assumptions, is that we'll undertake that exploration and be in a position to provide some advice and recommendation to council going into the 2023 budget. I know Mr. Greathead is here, but you can see that really not a particularly large amount of change, really mostly reflective, as I said, those increase in costs as a result of inflationary factors and increased labor costs. And there is also additional commitment throughout the service area in terms of the general maintenance area and commitment to asset management of our facilities. But so that's broadly. Happy to answer any other questions that council might have about any of the service area profiles there. And I know that Mr. Greathead, I believe that Mr. Greathead is on the line as well and would be able to assist where necessary.
Councillor Melnick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Given, on the operations page for log cabin, library, and washrooms, I see that the transfer payments in 2022 increased significantly from 2021. Is that a reflection of capital work that is being done and due to a government grant that we received? And my understanding is that work would be completed once we were able to expend those funds.
Thanks, Your Worship, for Councillor Melnick. Well, firstly, I believe that there may have there is a typo that administration wanted to highlight in that area. So actually in the 2021 year, the transfer payments were, I believe, 93,878. So not 38,000, it was 93,000. And so it looks like a pretty significant jump, but it actually is more of an incremental increase just to reflect the age of the facilities and increased cost of maintenance of those facilities. The capital for it, there is $200,000 in the capital budget for log cabin renovations, and that is reflective of provincial and federal funding that we received as a part of a larger grant. So the amount here does look more extreme, the jump from that 38,000 to 107,000, but it is actually not the case. The chart just didn't get updated because there were some transfers out, and that is essentially a typo.
Thank you for that clarity.
Other questions for Mr. Greathead or Mr. Given? Well, I have one for either of you. Page 44 of 56. If you have that in front of you, on the expense line, I do not understand that entry, other allowances and fees for elected officials.
Your Worship, can you clarify which service profile it is you're looking at by the?
I'm sorry, it is utilities water.
So, so we're not two utilities. We'll do utilities.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No less of a valid question of why
it is.
water.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, there's not a break. It goes grounds, cemetery, water. I see. Okay. I'm not there. I'm ahead of myself. So save that up for tomorrow. You've got the question now.
It's always nice to get a little bit of a heads up.
Councillor Demota.
I apologize if there's any growling in the background here. Just this might be kind of small in regards to the scope of operations, and I apologize for such a simple question, but the rent that we pay for staff housing that we pay out, where is that reflected in the operations budget here? Just because I'm only asking that because we have housing in here, and I was kind of hoping to see a plan down the road where we could find some zero net costs when it comes down to acquiring a little bit more housing. Because I believe right now we're spending about at least $54,000 in rent for staff housing. And as far as my approach to acquiring more staff housing for the municipality, I wanted to know that for future reference.
Your Worship, yes, Councillor Demoda is right. The cost of renting accommodations to support staff are part of the municipal budget. We are currently paying that out to a private owner. And I believe, and I know Ms. Malinchuk's been having a difficult time with her computer actually just the last little while. I believe that they are likely reflected in the contracted services and housing operations. And as you'll see in the service profile, administration is proposing to explore the concept of potentially renovating the municipally owned duplex to create additional ADUs. So that we may be able to host more of our municipal sort of term staff in those properties. Again, that would be something that we would explore in 2022 and bring any kind of recommendation to council with an appropriate business plan. But Councillor Demoda is 100% correct that at this time, the municipality is paying an expense in order to secure appropriate staff accommodation, or I should say to secure staff accommodation on an ongoing basis.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, just to clarify that. Okay, so currently those basements are undeveloped, and their money is not represented in this budget line, or sorry, this budget cycle. Just the exploration and budgeting, or quoting, or getting estimates on it will happen this year, and then it'll come back to council for next year.
That's right, Councillor Wilson. I mean, we also have employees that are currently living in the duplexes, and so we'd have to figure out how to manage that and come up with, again, a solid. My expectation is that we will deliver council with a solid business plan that says, identifies the costs and benefits of any potential solution that we wish to propose in the budget. This year's budget really is a stand pat budget in many ways in the operations area. Although John and his team have identified a number of opportunities that they'd like to explore in 2022, and that will have the potential for really positive impacts going into 2023. But you're exactly right. It's a planning year in 2022 with recommendations to come to council for 2023.
In terms of housing operations, that particular service profile, so page 39, the housing stock effectively breaks even absent the transfer payment. So if you subtract the transfer payment, the expenses are about $139,000 and the revenue is about 140. So it's dead on break even, except that we are then allocating some amount. I take it to reserves for replacement, recognizing that that is appropriate. Is there another way to attach this to, it's coming, I think, clearly from taxpayers. Does it belong here? Should the housing operations not cover their expenses first and then perhaps the excess to reserves. In this case, it'd only be less than 2,000, but it seems like an odd way to run a housing market when you manufacture to some extent a deficit based on a transfer payment. And I don't know how else we would do it. This is the way that's chosen, but it doesn't make logical sense to me, and nor does the particularity of the transfer payment. Why $78,986,000? Why not $75,000, some round number? How do we get so particular about a transfer to reserves?
I think, Your Worship, that how we're so particular about that number is reflective of the dedicated reserve fund being created for these properties. As council saw, at least one of our properties hadn't had significant improvements for a long period of time. I think based on that experience, our buildings and asset manager is advising that the appropriate approach would be to be putting away 3% every year and to be making small improvements on an ongoing basis. And so that's why it's such a peculiar number, because it's 3% of the assessed value of each of the properties, which is going to be transferred annually. And which will allow us to, be able to support any sort of operational maintenance costs and hopefully contribute towards any minor capital costs. If there were major capital costs, those may be decisions that would come independently to council. But I think the intention here is to be more proactive and more planful than maybe had happened in the past with the Cabin Creek House, where council, I think, was surprised to learn that there was a significant deferred capital maintenance on that property and a significant bill that came up. And so this is more of a ongoing planful approach that's being recommended by the operations department.
Thank you very much. 3% of assessed value or appraised value?
Assessed value.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Greathead or Mr. Gibbon? Councillor Wilson.
Previously, cemetery and the operations around that had fallen under legislative services, if I'm not wrong. Is Mrs. Nadon still involved in some aspect of the cemetery operations?
So there's Your Worship, if I may, for Councillor Wilson's question, there's a bit of a distinction between the administrative support for cemetery, and a portion of that cost is reflected here. But then there's also the costs of more in-house service that we've been providing in terms of grounds operations, actually out at the cemetery. And so the profile that you see here is reflective of a small portion of that of the salary, the administrative support that is reflected there. That's essentially the $23,000 is a portion of somebody's salary to answer the phone and make arrangements and do the planning. Yeah, and so that's really largely what you see reflected there. So Ms. Nadon, the function is actually hosted with an employee that reports to Ms. Nadon for right now. And as mentioned in the service profile, that's something that we hope to explore through 2022, is just where the right place for that administrative support for cemetery operations lies. Who is the right person, or what is the right department to be receiving those calls?
I see no other hands, so I will ask another question, if I may, Mr. Gibbon, through you or to you. With respect to the service profile for roads, the second of that's page 40 that I'm looking at. The second of the planning assumptions references that an in-house service review will be conducted in 2022. First question is the cost of that embedded in the amount for contract services? And secondly, what is intended to be encompassed by that service review? Is that something that is likely to come back to council to review service levels? Or is this a more operational service review dealing with route structures and plowing frequencies? What is intended by that service review?
Your Worship, I'm going to hand that over to Mr. Greathead. He and his team have done a lot of work to consider how they can find additional efficiencies in all their service areas. And so Mr. Greathead can speak to what's intended through that in-house service review.
Thank you, Your Worship and Council. Yes, what we plan on doing is taking in and just as we're doing with the solid waste management, we had committed to bringing out a service review on that. A lot of it was the formative steps is actually finding out where we need to go to develop a master plan. So we will be coming back in 2023 once we've actually fleshed out where we think the efficiencies can be found, the improvements that we'd like to recommend to council, and that sort of thing. I figure our cost in 2022 would be pretty negligible at this point, and would be able to be covered under the contract services.
So Your Worship, just to supplement that, I think 2022 is really a scoping year, where in-house they're going to scope the areas that they'd like to explore for additional efficiencies, with any additional outside support being focused in on those areas that are identified first internally before getting some outside expertise to apply to the issues.
Right. Well, I appreciate that from both of you. I appreciate that continued focus on finding efficiencies within that department. Really important work. And so when you get that done, I know the council will be very, very receptive to whatever report you come up with. So thank you for that. Other questions for Mr. Given or Mr. Greathead? I think Councillor Wilson first and then Councillor Demore.
And I guess it doesn't have to be answered now, and I should probably have asked it at every other department as we kind of went through. But at the start of the meeting, we had, or presentation, we had, the discussion of like, what are the big asks and what is really driving the increase in taxes, and in the whole operation budget, what are the big ticket items that are is there one that's increasing the budget drastically, or is it all just kind of everything's incremental and there's not, and nothing's really standing out? Is there something you can highlight, or is it too broad?
Your Worship, I know Mr. Greathead's connection is a little fuzzy, and so I'll answer on his behalf. And John, if I get it wrong, don't be shy about correcting me. But I think it really is an incremental change. There is additional commitment to asset management, and so in some areas, particularly for maintenance of facilities, there are smaller. As we mentioned in the housing area, there's that sort of 3% of assessed value now starting to be contributed to a smaller reserve there. That's not a game changer. It's an important piece of work, but it isn't the major thing driving costs. If you look, and I'll just share my screen again to go back to the overall departmental budget, and you can see here that through the different program areas within operations, in general maintenance, log cabin, washrooms, housing operations, everything, there really aren't any step changes. There's nothing that jumps up by a big amount in any of those sections. They really are more of the nature of incremental changes, which is generally reflective of, labor is significant in this area. There's a lot of our municipal team members that work in the operations area. And there is that labor increment in 2022. And then also goods and materials, goods and supplies will be going up. And so we have applied an inflationary factor there. And I think that's generally what you see. Mr. Greathead, if there are any specific items that really stood out to you or Ms. Malinchuk that you wanted to highlight in this area, by all means do. But I think as council can see here, it is generally that incremental increase reflective of broader costs rather than any sort of step change of a new program or a new staff or and again, this is on the operational side, not the capital side. So there aren't any big capital asks that you're seeing here. Ms. Malinchuk?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Given. The only thing that I can really say, looking at it quickly, is that about 80,000 of the increase in expenses are going to reserves. So 80,000 of that is increases there. There is one significant area of 40,000 going to sidewalk repairs because there's a lot of tripping hazards and whatnot. Otherwise, yes, very incremental up and down where it's needed.
Go ahead, Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, just to follow up then, yeah, thank you. And that's what I kind of assumed as well. But when you just mentioned the 82 reserves, last year, 2021, did we scale back money to reserves, and are we stepping back up to kind of a normal rate? I can't quite remember, but I'm kind of thinking that we did scale back monies to reserves last year, and maybe are we coming back to something that are a bit more normal, or yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm just bringing up the reserve spreadsheet that I was working on today, actually. And if I can have 2 seconds to bring it up. In operations, themselves, there was 30,000 that was allocated from the housing to the COVID reserves as part of the reduction in some of the areas that where we were decreasing about 250,000 at the budget approval time. And then just to be clear, we're talking about also, there's some areas that have never seen reserve transfers for fleet in those areas. For instance, roads has never seen an actual reserve transfer for fleet. And grounds has never seen one. So we are trying to get to a point where we get our asset management under control. And this is one area that we could probably get it to the appropriate levels in 10 years by contributing this little bit more every year. And but they haven't seen it, and it is needed. Our reserves are quite low considering what the needs are of our asset management going forward. So that's just a quick highlight, but there can be a more detailed document given to council as well on what is going on with the reserves, but there was some impacts for operations, especially in those areas in fleet and machinery and equipment. And tomorrow we're going to also talk about water and sewer and what we need to do to get up to the right areas over the coming years.
Thank you for that. Councillor Demota.
Well, if we're getting near the end of this, because we were on the conversation, I'm glad that Councillor Wilson brought it up and we're on the topic. I would like to be able to see what we're transferring to capital and reserves into some format, because I think when you look at it, 16% is a pretty high number. And I know that that wasn't going to be the end number. And I really appreciate getting everything out on the table so that we can discuss it and then work towards what our priority should be, or have more of a priority based look at things. Because, you know, I think personally, I'd like to find $400,000 worth of savings within this budget, and then apply half of the most money that's been left over, our just COVID reserve, I should say, because the most money's already been used. So this is a surplus left over from that. And so getting back to that, at the beginning of the presentation, there was a reference made to $500,000 of the most funding already been attributed to this, or sorry, COVID relief being attributed to this. Please accept my apologies if I'm going to cause some repetition here, but did we get a detail of where that $500,000 was placed within here? Exactly.
Mr. Given.
Yes, Your Worship, for Councillor Demota. Councillor Demota, I think we reflected earlier on, and we've gone through a lot of pages already, so
yes.
No surprise, but we reflected it. It's in the taxation, finance and administration taxation service profile. I reflected that you can share with council. You can see in 2021, there was $1.2 million in transfer in from reserves. That declines to $500,000 in 2022 and $250,000 in 2023.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
All right, at this time, I see no further direct questions for Mr. Given or Mr. Greathead with respect to the operations budget. We're now at 9:20. We have staff still on. We had promised a 9 o'clock end time for today. We're overtime. I'm going to suggest at this time that I am merely going to call a recess. It's going to be a recess for 20 hours and 40 minutes. So do what you will, and we will all reconvene here at 6 p.m. again tomorrow night, and we will commence with agenda item 2.6, community group requests. So thank you all. Thank you to all of our staff who hung with us the entire time, and certainly thank you to any members of the public who got through 3 hours and 21 minutes of these presentations. And thank you, Mr. Given, for the excellent work introducing all of the topics, and for all staff getting us through the department budgets. It's all very much appreciated. And good evening all. We'll see you all again tomorrow night.
Thank you.